Introduction. She broke stereotypes. She captivated the world. During the Vietnam War, which is known in Vietnam as the American War, U.S. leaders led those of us in the West to believe the Viet Cong were ignorant, barefoot peasants. Then, on November 4th, 1968, there appeared on the world stage at the Paris Conference on Vietnam the Viet Cong's official advance representative, a petite, demure woman of startling elegance and presence in an ao dai. The Vietnamese traditional dress that looks like a Western evening gown. She spoke quietly, calmly, forcefully. The world listened. Her name was Nguyen Thi Binh, but this was not her real name. So who was she? Now at last we can know. Nguyen Thi Binh, 1927, birth name Nguyen Thi Chau Sa. First revolutionary alias, Yin Sa, came from a family of patriots. Her maternal grandfather was the famous and beloved patriot scholar Phan Chau, Chu Trinh, 1872 to 1926. Her father, also a patriot, worked for the French administration as a surveyor, taking his family with him in the Mekong Delta, where they lived on a boat. Later, the family moved to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where young Chau Sa studied in a French school. She was the eldest child and close to her siblings as she is today. Chau Sa excelled in mathematics and sports. She competed in cross-country races and basketball games, an American invention. Then the revolution and war intervened, as it did for all Vietnamese of her generation. Madame Binh, as she is called by many people both inside and outside Vietnam, never finished her baccalaureate. However, she holds a doctorate from a prestigious French institution in the colonial prison system for political activists. The French and later the Americans thought they could repress nationalism by arresting revolutionary patriots. Instead, their jails became graduate schools, where political prisoners organized classes and shared expertise. The curricula ranged from literacy training to the Chinese ideographs in Tang Dynasty poetry, from basic numeracy training to mathematics and physics, from the works of Victor Hugo, Marx, and Lenin to those of Ho Chi Minh. In April 1951, the American-backed Saigon authorities arrested Yin Sa and held her in Catinat Detention Center. Like her brothers and sisters in the revolution, she was tortured. Political prisoners passed along personal experiences on how to organize for the revolution and how to withstand torture if arrested. Writing now, many years later, Nguyen Thi Binh gives her readers a mini lesson. I was cruelly beaten without stopping because an earlier arrestee had broken down under torture and given my name. First, they tortured with savage beatings, then by submerging us in water, then with electricity. Then, I want to die, so they would finish. I was most worried about breaking under torture and giving names, leading the enemy to arrest others. I decided that I would accept whatever the enemy said about me. But my one purpose was to say nothing else. After a time, the torturers saw they could not wrest any information from me. Madame Binh spent 3 years in Chi Hoa, the most infamous of the Saigon prisons. Political prisoner doctoral graduates during the French War and the American War learned how to be stalwart under the most intense pressure imaginable. That lesson served them well in many venues. While at Paris, Madame Binh was deputy head of the delegation from the National Liberation Front, NLF, of South Vietnam until the formation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam on June 6, 1969, whereupon she became the PRG Foreign Minister and the head of the PRG delegation to the Paris Conference. Henry Kissinger and his American colleagues at the Paris Conference on Vietnam, 1968 to 1973, faced 3 key Vietnamese opponents. Lu Duc Tho, special advisor to the delegation from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The DRVN, or North Vietnam, Xuan Thuy, head of the DRVN delegation, and Madame Binh. All three held doctorates from prestigious French institutions. In his introduction to the Vietnamese edition of Family, Friends, and Country, writer Nguyen Thi cautions readers not to expect new information about the Paris Conference. However, Nguyen Thi was writing for Vietnamese who had seen or read many interviews with Paris participants. In contrast, international readers will find much to learn from Nguyen Thi Binh, the only living signatory to the Paris Agreement. International readers may be surprised to see that on January 1, 1969, the Vietnamese published Ho Chi Minh's New Year's Greetings with President Ho's unshakable two-step strategy. His New Year's poem ran on the Vietnamese newspapers' front pages. Liberation Radio in the South and Voice of Vietnam in the North repeatedly promulgated the president's greetings. U.S. leaders seem not to have paid much attention. Yet the Vietnamese in both the former North and former South who participated in the war's three arrows, the interlocking political, military, and diplomatic initiatives, can still recite the two-stage plan that President Ho crystallized in his quatrain's second line. Fight so the Americans leave. Fight so the puppets collapse. The Paris Agreement completed the first step in President Ho's strategy. As Nguyen Thi Binh writes, we achieved a momentous victory. The United States was forced to withdraw completely, while Vietnamese troops remained on Vietnamese land. Family, Friends, and Country answers many questions about deeper levels of the Vietnamese two-stage strategy. Madame Binh's writing style is subtle and fluid. It is easy to read this book quickly and miss important points. For example, many Westerners wonder about the relationship between the DRVN and PRG delegations at Paris. Nguyen Thi Binh may be the first Vietnamese writing for a general audience to state the relationship clearly, but she does so briefly. Although two, we were one. Although one, we were two. The two delegations were closely coordinated under one source of flexible, precise guidance, which came from inside our country. The National Liberation Front had been established on December 20th, 1960 as a neutral, neither overtly pro-communist nor overtly pro-capitalist, all-inclusive organization of patriots to represent the people of the South. The neutral stance allowed the NLF-PRG to participate and subsequently to join the non-aligned movement. Official neutrality also fostered greater access to the international peace and anti-war movements. Nevertheless, senior NLF-PRG leaders were party activists. Their key visionary was Ho Chi Minh, who determined not only the overall NLF-PRG strategy, but also many of its subtleties. Attentive readers will notice that Tran Bu Kim, head of the NLF delegation, and Nguyen Thi Binh, head of the PRG delegation, which replaced the NLF delegation at Paris, and not Xuan Thuy, head of the DRVN delegation, the North presented the 10 points, 8 points, 7 points, and 2 points in successive diplomatic offensives. The two delegations' shared goal was independence and freedom for South Vietnam and reunification of the entire country. Thus, readers will notice that Madame Binh returned from a consultative visit in Hanoi with the 10 points in hand. DRVN delegation head Xuan Thuy, a journalist, newspaper editor, poet, chess aficionado, and diplomat, was famous for his smile, dignified bearing, and his genuine, perceptive charm. His subtlety kept the focus on the NLF-PRG as representatives of the Southern people. He would gracefully and astutely use the Western custom of ladies first to introduce the genteel. Representative of the Viet Cong first, thereby emphasizing the PRG position. Nguyen Thi could not have done this so easily had the PRG delegation's head been a man. Vietnam, a small country, faced a behemoth at Paris. Ho Chi Minh was a realist with many years' experience living in the West, including a year in the United States when he was in his early 20s. President Ho and his colleagues knew that to negotiate successfully with the United States, they must first draw world opinion behind their cause. American leaders, remembering that Vietnam had recently fought a war with France, may have thought Paris would give the United States a slight advantage at the negotiations. The opposite was true. The DRVN and NLF were delighted with the choice of Paris, even though Paris was a long distance from Hanoi. Members of both delegations had many French friends both officially and informally. On September 1st, 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle, speaking in Phnom Penh, had delivered his famous policy statement urging American withdrawal. The French government offered to host the Paris conference and financially supported the DRVN and NLF-PRG delegations with security and transportation. In addition, France had an active Communist Party, which contributed housing for the delegations, arranged sites for the private bilateral meetings that the DRVN hosted, and supplied security personnel and drivers. Overseas Vietnamese living in Paris provided tailored suits for the men, custom-fitted, dice for the women, and home-cooked family meals so delegates could savor ordinary family life with children. The overseas Vietnamese also provided interpretation at public press events, although of course they were never involved in any official or even informal diplomatic meetings. Most important of all, the overseas Vietnamese showed up en masse in front of Kleber International Conference Center, waving DRVN and NLF-PRG flags. Paris was the media capital of Europe and a perfect setting for the long-term tactic of seeking international press coverage and widespread citizen support from across the world for the Vietnamese cause in general and, in particular, for President Ho's strategic step one, American withdrawal. The DRVN and NLF-PRG delegations each included a solid contingent of journalists. Liberation Radio and the South telegraphed out to Hanoi the news of American offensives, atrocities, and bombing in the South. Each week, a North Vietnamese envoy traveled overland from the center of the country to Hanoi, carrying news and photographic film about U.S. bombing in that region. Hanoi then forwarded the latest news and documentation from both the North and the South to Paris in time for the Thursday post-conference briefings. Delegation journalists wrote press releases, while Nguyen Thi and Nguyen Thi Binh concentrated on interviews with radio, TV, and print journalists from all over the world, in addition to their Thursday briefings. Overseas Vietnamese living in Paris sponsored their own press conferences and provided additional interpreters. This complex, carefully directed publicity galvanized world opinion in support of the DRVN and NLF-PRG delegations' shared cause. Such international exposure, which was impossible in Hanoi, was facilitated by the conference location in Paris. Nevertheless, the public relations process was daunting and draining. Family, friends, and country offers an intimate view of Madame Binh's apprehension when facing aggressive Western journalists. In addition, we also now have the backstory for the thorny question of North Vietnamese soldiers in the South. Nguyen Thi Binh had received a simple, yet seemingly impossible directive. You must not say Northern troops are in the South. You must not say, Northern troops are not in the South. As one of the long-haired warriors in Paris, Madame Binh had clear marching orders. She tells us how she held her stance, parrying the journalist's fiercely repetitive, aggressive questions. Now, too, we have the truth of the personal worries lying beneath Nguyen Thi Binh's composure. She spoke about the U.S. bombing of civilians, hiding her anxiety when she did not know if her young son and daughter had survived U.S. bombs. She spoke about political prisoners, concealing her personal agony. Very shortly after her appointment to Paris, the U.S.-backed Saigon authorities arrested Madame Binh's younger brother, Nguyen Thi, whom the authorities tortured and detained for nearly 7 years in Con Son prison's tiger cages. The French had secured rights to Con Son Island south of Saigon in 1783, but occupied it only in 1861. They began to turn the island into a prison for political activists in 1862. In 1940, the French added 120 tiger cages. Guards walking on the rebar roof threw lime down on the prisoners. One cage usually held 5 prisoners. The cell's dimensions of 1.45 by 2. 5 meters meant 2 prisoners slept atop the other 3. Unlike American POWs captured in the South and in the North during the U.S. Air War, Nguyen Thi was not released in accordance with the January 1973 Paris Agreement. He and many other Vietnamese in the South were not freed from the tiger cages until May 1, 1975, the day after the war ended. The DRVN and NLF-PRG's shared strategy at Paris also included people-to-people diplomacy, where individuals and groups seek to affect policy. In family, for then in Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, President Ho emphasized the importance of organizing people worldwide. International readers will be impressed to see how much careful thought, planning, and just plain good luck contributed to the success of the NLF-PRG's activities with the peace and anti-war movements in Europe, Africa, Latin America, the former Soviet Union, China, and North America, particularly the United States. These efforts included the more formal activities with the non-aligned nations movement. In those days, the NEA meetings were gatherings of male heads of state and foreign ministers. One can imagine how the entrance of a petite Asian woman in an elegant Ao-Dai accented with a silk neck scarf must have turned heads, causing senior NAM leaders to whisper, "Who is that?" Many international activists would have found these challenges daunting, but the DRVN and NLF-PRG delegations' commitment to their cause was unshakable. Madame Binh's skills and natural talents, all the more remarkable for a woman at that time, made such commitment even more effective, as Nguyen Thi Binh makes clear in the beginning of this memoir. She came to maturity during the mid-late 1940s and early 1950s as a community organizer of mass demonstrations in Saigon. Now, for the first time, we have an English account of the French reinvasion of Saigon with British and American backing in late September 1945, 3 weeks after Vietnam's declaration of independence. The perspective is that of a young, idealistic 18-year-old. We are there with young Madame Binh at the outset of the French War in her efforts to persuade others to the cause. There with her in the mass demonstrations, and there for her youthful breaches of discipline, which exposed her undercover identity. Perhaps most surprising for Western readers will be Madame Binh's first-hand account of the repression of activists' attempts to promulgate the contents of the 1954 Geneva Agreement. Those arrested included the wealthy Saigon lawyer and activist Nguyen Thi, though, later vice president of reunited Vietnam. For Madame Binh, her later roles at Paris and in people-to-people diplomacy were versions of her earlier community organizing writ large on the world stage. An unasked question remains. Who cast Nguyen Thi Binh for this role? It seems likely that only one person in the Politburo of the Vietnamese Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party, had the depth of vision and the breadth of experience to think of choosing a woman. President Ho Chi Minh had lived in New York and Boston during the peak of the women's suffrage movement, before World War I. After World War I, he lived and worked in Paris. His earliest writings about women's rights appeared in 1922. During the mid-1920s, he pushed women's rights in his classes and writings for young revolutionaries. Ho Chi Minh knew that. The Operating over Soviet ni setting Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter Phát Phan Châu Ding as Agret Patriot Nationit, an early Vietnamese advocate of democracy. Phan Chau Trinh had mentored young Ho Chi Minh during their shared years in Paris from the late teens through the early 1920s. From family, friends, and country, we know Ho Chi Minh asked to meet Nguyen Thi Binh shortly after she regrouped from the south to the north in accordance with requirements stipulated in the 1954 Geneva Agreement. Madame Binh met Ho Chi Minh subsequently on various occasions before the Paris Conference. President Ho knew that Nguyen Thi Binh possessed the generous, open, and honest personality needed to win over those holding different views. He would have known that her quietly forceful and gracious presence as Viet Song representative would challenge stereotypes and command attention whenever and wherever she stepped on stage. He probably also realized he could find no Southern representative with a family heritage of greater resonance to encourage support from overseas Vietnamese. Thus, it is no wonder that Nguyen Thi Binh is the Vietnamese participant at Paris whom many people outside Vietnam remember most clearly. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After the war ended in April 1975, the Viet National Assembly met in July 1976, drawing representatives from across the country to reunite North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Reunification combined the PRG and DRVN into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the country's formal name today. In 1976, Nguyen Thi Binh became Minister of Education for reunited Vietnam. By 1976, Madame Binh had become an experienced negotiator and spokesperson. She was not only the most famous Vietnamese outside the country, but also through her work with the non-aligned movement. The Vietnamese diplomat who had the deepest relationships with foreign leaders. Thus, many foreigners and Vietnamese alike wonder why the senior Vietnamese leadership did not select Madame Binh to serve as Foreign Minister of newly reunited Vietnam. The answer is simple. The times had changed. Vietnam faced incursions from the Khmer Rouge into southern Vietnam, rumblings with China on the northern border, and an intensive U.S. embargo. Amidst those external challenges was a momentous internal challenge that would be crucial to the new nation's future: reuniting the country's education. The skills that had served Madame Binh in Paris and her southern roots as a granddaughter of one of Vietnam's most famous educators made her an obvious choice for the daunting task of weaving two very different educational systems into one. The Vietnamese people could not reunite into one country unless and until Northerners and Southerners shared the same level of education. The low literacy rate in the former South compared with the high literacy rate in the North, and the lack of trained teachers were huge obstacles. Creating a comprehensive and effective educational system amidst internal political challenges and a stifling bureaucracy was a huge assignment, to which she devoted a decade. Subsequently, Madame Binh worked again in people-to-people diplomacy. Then, from 1992 until 2002, she served as Vietnam's vice president, with responsibilities including state diplomacy, education, health, and judicial reform. The chapters in family, friends, and country describing state service in newly reunited Vietnam are a manual written in anecdotes for those who want to learn about assertive, but not aggressive, relations across cultures. Even in war, the greatest of cross-cultural conflicts, they are also a guide for managing bureaucratic tangles conservatism, and obstinacy, always with an eye toward ethical action. Madame Binh formally retired in 2002 at the age of 75. She notes that her years since have been very busy, at times even busier than before. She worries, when will we have a society that is truly democratic, equal, and cultured? It is as if these dynamics harass me. I cannot sit still. I must continue to take a full part in life. Perhaps it is my fate from when I was young. I want always to be deeply involved and committed in my work. I'm not able and don't know how to stand on the outside. These days, Madame Binh cares as fiercely as ever about children and adults suffering from the effects of Agent Orange and unexploded bombs and mines left from the war. She holds strong positions on rights for women and children. She travels often to domestic and international conferences covering many issues. Yet her deepest commitment remains to Vietnam's future. She worries that the Vietnamese educational system, once among the world's best in spreading limited resources to the most students and adults, has become seriously backward. She adds, as long as I have an ounce of strength, I will voluntarily contribute everything I can to the important and decisive issue of education. Indeed, here is a feisty activist in her late 80s who refuses to wait in the wings. She still takes center stage. She is still petite and demure. She still speaks quietly, calmly, forcefully. The world still listens. Lady Botan Hanoi, Vietnam Spring 2015. Preface. In the reader's hands is a memoir by Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, former Vice President of Vietnam, the country's first woman foreign minister, and head of the delegation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam at the Paris Conference, 1968 to 1973. The first thoughts of quite a few people when they pick up this book is curiosity as they anticipate extraordinary stories about the author's participation in the famous negotiations that were the longest in the history of diplomacy. One must say immediately that this particular wish won't be satisfied. However, do understand that this small book contains many extraordinary events, but of a different kind about one person, about her way, and about her life. The simple title she chose, Family, Friends and Country, captures the sources creating her special strength. Many people who know Madame Nguyen Thi Binh are surprised by 2 points. The first is her appealing strength and persuasive character, qualities that strike not only people in our country, but also so many foreigners, including some famous and difficult ones. We know that not long after 1979, many of our long-term foreign friends did not understand when we had to implement the border war in the West and South to oppose the repeated Pol Pot incursions and save the Cambodian people from genocide. They sought out Madame Binh. After they heard her explanation, these foreigners said, "All right, we've heard many Vietnamese speak, but when Madame Binh speaks, we believe and trust." During our terribly difficult years of the cruel war against foreign aggression, Nguyen Thi Binh visited all over the world. Wherever she went, people said the same thing. If Binh speaks, then we believe. We can say without fear of error that perhaps Madame Binh is the Vietnamese person with the most friends across the world, from ordinary people to famous heads of state, who represented many different political views. During the war years, she traveled across most of the planet. Here's what was truly unusual and beautiful. The image of Vietnam during our devastating struggle was not an armed warrior, but rather a slender, unassuming yet erudite woman who was personable and who spoke clearly. Decisive events could not change her leisurely, self-confident presence. She called her work people-to-people diplomacy, meaning one person to another person, one heart to another heart. She brought many friends to our nation's side. This was an important, decisive point in Vietnam's unusual victory during the last century. The second unusual point about Nguyen Thi Binh is the youthful strength of her intellect and spirit, her life force, her stunning endurance, and her wide yet deep point of view, which has expanded even during her older years. It seems as if she still stands in our front line, working tirelessly in all the key and important areas of our society's life. I was fortunate to work with Madam Nguyen Thi Binh and be near her for a number of years. I am honored to introduce readers to her writing, which calls on us all to think deeply not only about those seething days in the past, but also about our country today and tomorrow. Nguyen Nuc, writer. Translator's note. Madam Nguyen Thi Binh's family. Friends and Country is perhaps the best book in English from Vietnam to give us insight into life among resistance activists, the Viet Minh, later called the Viet Cong. In the south of Vietnam during the French War and the American War, the Vietnamese name for the Western term, Vietnam War. Madame Binh wrote this memoir for Vietnamese readers, but also with foreign friends in mind. However, much of the text assumes Vietnamese readers' knowledge of their own country's history and culture. For that reason, this English version includes annotations, which can be easily read at the foot of the page or just as easily skipped. I have kept the notes about international figures and major Vietnamese leaders brief, since more information is immediately available in English on the web at Wikipedia and other sites. The notes about other Vietnamese figures and points of history and culture are more detailed, with information drawn from interviews and from books and websites available only in Vietnamese. I am grateful to Madam Binh for her guidance and to her colleagues, Pham Ngac and Nguyen Van Huynh, for answering specific questions. I also want to thank fellow Westerners Florence Howe, Randy Ross, Judy Gumbo Albert, and Margaret Schlosser for their editorial advice, copy editing, and proofreading. Lady Borton, Hanoi, Vietnam, Spring 2015. My homeland, Quang Nam, my native province, was split into two because of the special circumstances that arose during the American War. After 1975, Quang Nam once again became one province. My ancestral home of Quang Nam is not opulent, but it is abundant and diverse, with bright green rice paddies and many rivers. There is the famous Thursday Bon River, the Han River, which is short but full and strong, and the Truong Jong River, which is very special in that it does not pour down from the mountains, but rather connects one estuary to another. Then there is the Tam Kai River, which appears blue throughout the seasons, and the Co Co River, which is like a natural canal intertwining and connecting all the waterways across the province. People say Quang Nam Province is unique because its waterways, whether large or small, flow freely across the province without finding their way to the sea. Quang Nam also has mountains, the sea, islands, and beaches, which some people consider the most beautiful in the world. UNESCO has listed Quang Nam's Cham Island in its world network of biosphere reserves. Quang Nam also has Hoi An from the 16th and 17th centuries onward. Hoi An was a bustling port and the first place in our country to interact directly with the West. Hoi An residents conducted business with the Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch traders who arrived early on. The local residents gained experience in international business transactions and the cultures of other civilizations. They also developed a personal dynamism, which was genuine. Da Nang, which is less than 30 kilometers from Hoi An, is the largest international gateway to Quang Nam Province and Vietnam's central region. In 1997, Da Nang City became one among several major cities, linking directly to our national government's central level. The remainder of the province retained the name of Quang Nam, but with its provincial capital located in Tam Kai City. Although Quang Nam Province and Da Nang City are administratively separate, their history, traditions, and culture have always been one. This strategic location led the French to station their first soldiers at Da Nang when they invaded our country in the 19th century. More than a century later, the Americans landed their assault Marines en masse at Da Nang to open the U.S. limited war in South Vietnam. The United States converted Da Nang into a huge air, infantry, and naval base to command the battlefields in the central region of Vietnam, in the Central Highlands, and as far north as the 17th parallel. In addition, Da Nang was an air base for U.S. bombing raids against North Vietnam. In modern times, Quang Nam, and especially Da Nang, were major spear points in our resistance wars against foreign aggressors and, therefore, were among our country's fiercest battlefields. The people of Quang Nam and Da Nang suffered courageously. They endured enormous sacrifices. Quang Nam, Da Nang has over 7,000 heroic Vietnamese mothers. It is poignant testimony that they comprise more than 1/4 of the heroic mothers from across Vietnam. Indeed, the people of my ancestral homeland deserve the assessment of loyal, brave, and resilient. I returned to my ancestral homeland in 1975 after we had completely liberated South Vietnam. I was horrified to see that the U.S. and Saigon authorities' armies had bulldozed, leveled, and completely devastated so many villages during their policy of free fire zones. Go Noi, Dien Bang. My paternal ancestral homeland, and formerly one of the richest areas of Quang Nam, had been known for its productive fields and green marshes along the Thursday Bon River. From long before, that area had been famous for its silk, which had even reached European markets. However, after the war, all that remained was an expanse of bare land, a vast wasteland of sedge grass without the shadow of even a tree, without the shadow of even a single human being. My maternal ancestral homeland to the west of Tam Kai was also an area that had suffered from intense cruelty. The war had also destroyed its villages. The aftermath of war in Quang Nam was devastating, especially the effects of Agent Orange, one of the defoliants that the United States sprayed for years. The after effects continue even today. During the 40 years since the American War ended, the people of Quang Nam, Da Nang have managed to rebuild. In truth, they have rescued life from ashes. Not only were Quang inhabitants staunch during our wars for national liberation, but they are also proud to have contributed significantly to our national culture. For generations, Quang Nam has had a reputation as a seat of great learning with a tradition of eager students and many excellent scholars. At one point, the entire country knew the names of the 5 Quang Nam doctoral scholars and the 4 Quang Nam champions. In the early 20th century, Quang Nam was one of the sites of the Eastern Capital Free School movement, Dong Kin Nia Tuk, and a modernization movement, Due Tan. Quang Nam still has many areas of extreme poverty, particularly in its mountains. However, nature has her own laws of compensation. The Tien Phuc area of my maternal ancestral homeland, where dogs eat stones and chickens eat gravel, is the cradle of great patriots. These include my Matang Gang Fat, Fan Chou Jing, An So Nao Es Fan Qiu Jing, and Elder Nguyen Thu Cang. Elder Cang served as interim president of the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1946, while President Ho Chi Minh was in France. People have different opinions about my grandfather's political views. Nevertheless, He is widely recognized as the first Vietnamese person to introduce the concepts of democracy and civil rights in Vietnam. The father of President Ho Chi Minh, Junior Dr. Nguyen Thi Binh described Phan Chau Trinh as a friend, a fellow graduate, and the first person to organize for citizens' rights in Nam, Vietnam. Historian Hong Xuan Han speaks about the scholar patriots searching for a way to save our nation at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. He points out that Elder Phan Chau Trinh was the first person to identify our culture's disastrous backwardness as the primary reason we lost control of our country at the time of the French invasion. Elder Phan defined the process necessary to develop our nation, expand the people's cultural standard, encourage the people's zeal, and support the people's material needs. He was unequivocal. Best of all, study. From this, we can understand his message. The people needed knowledge and understanding in order to awaken national self-esteem. Only then could they undertake the great dual causes of freedom and happiness. I believe these profound ideals hold priceless long-term value. I believe they apply to all of us today. People regard Elder Phan Chau Trinh as the embodiment of Quang character, for he was forthright, purposeful, and independent. The argumentative habit of the Quang inhabitants was evident in his personality. Quang people tend to be passionate about their work. They will take responsibility for the community and for the nation, and they will accept a challenge and plunge in energetically. At the same time, Quang people are rather sentimental, open, and receptive to what is new. Those qualities have led to the following lines from oral poetry. Quang Nam soil is quick to absorb moisture even before it rains. Quang Nam's people grow tipsy even before sipping red wine. Many of my friends say I inherited the traits of a person from Quang Nam. Childhood. My mother was the second daughter of Elder Phan Chau Trinh and a native of Tien Phuc District's eastern area, which is now part of Punin District to the west of Tam Khai, provincial capital. My paternal grandfather, a native of Dien Bon District, was a volunteer soldier in the Save the King movement. My father, the 10th child in his family, was an official geophysical surveyor. After graduation, he worked in the southwest of Vietnam, always floating on a huge river barge. I was born in Tan Hy Commune, Sa Det Province. My parents named me Sa. According to my mother's story, on one occasion, when I was 9 months old and learning to crawl, I slipped into the Tien River, but they immediately fished me out. Since I spent some of my childhood in rural areas, I developed a little understanding of farming, fishing, and catching shrimp. I will always remember the rainy season in the western delta of southern Vietnam, how the rice paddies would flood with water as vast as the sea. Those childhood days had an enduring influence on my entire life, on my activism in social affairs, and on my personal life. Later, the French authorities assigned my father to work in Cambodia. He took the whole family with him, settling us in Phnom Penh for some years. My mother gave birth 7 times. 1 child died from illness, leaving 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. I am the eldest. In addition, several cousins from the countryside came to live with us. Because of economic difficulties, these cousins' families had asked my father to help them continue their education or to find them employment. Our house was always full and happy. Eating meals involved 2 shifts, since we did not have enough table space for everyone at once. Although my father's salary was neither high nor low, he would always help our relatives. Father was hardworking, and he was passionate about technology. On the ground floor, he had a room filled with the machine parts he used for repairs and innovations. Anyone looking for my father after work hours could find him in his special warehouse. Perhaps because my father was dedicated to his profession, He judged people by their attitude toward work. Since a hard, working person was good, he did not like anyone who was lazy. As for us children, he demanded the same from us, whether we were boys or girls. If we knew how to ride a bicycle, then we must also know how to repair the bike and fix its tires. My father liked it when we were eager students reading books and playing sports, but he disliked it when we spent time singing songs and socializing with friends. Later, during my years as an activist and organizer, I always felt close to working people and found it easy to associate with them. I found I usually assessed people through their attitude toward work and their relationship with working people. Thinking back, I am thankful my father had that influence on me. My mother was not healthy, perhaps because she had given birth so often. When she died, I was 16. My youngest sibling was not quite a year old. I'd had a happy childhood filled with warmth and with the love of parents and relatives. When my mother passed away, I felt anxious and deprived of affection. However, watching my younger siblings, who were so small and vulnerable, I began to sense my own responsibility. I knew I must replace my mother and care for the younger children. While alive, my mother often told me stories about my maternal grandfather, Elder Phan Chau Chu Trinh. He passed away in 1926, about a year after returning from France. I never met Phan Chau Trinh in person and did not directly receive the influence of his expansive, patriotic thinking. From what my mother told me, I know circumstances forced my grandfather to wander across the country from a young age. Then the colonizers arrested him because of his anti-French activities. They might have guillotined Phan Chau Trinh if progressive members of the French Alliance for Human Rights had not zealously supported him. After his release from Con Dao political prison, Phan Chau Trinh requested that the colonial authorities let him go to France, where he lived for 14 years. His intention was to search for support from progressive forces in France in order to pursue independence for our homeland. Even though my family did not live in Vietnam during the early 1940s, news of the communist insurgency in my now Tien Giang province and a number of other southern provinces reached us. Back then, I noticed that my mother often expressed sadness and confided to her close friends, saying, "When will our people fight the French?" In Cambodia, our family lived on Mishi Boulevard, now Priya Boulevard, in Phnom Penh, the capital. Our house of wood had a very special architecture because my father had designed it according to his own specific ideas. The house was spacious, airy, and set behind a wide, sandy area, which would become as white as snow when the moon was full. On moonlit nights, we children loved to chase each other on that white sand. Behind the house were rice paddies. During the rainy season, floodwaters would reach our house pillars. I will always remember the image of our familial house and a childhood shared with my siblings during those years when we still had both our father and our mother. I attended Lycée Sisawat, the largest middle school in Cambodia. Since my father was a civil servant, I received free tuition in the French mother country school instead of attending the school for indigenous children. Most of my fellow students were children of civil servants who were either French or Vietnamese with French citizenship. My nationalist spirit shared by my younger siblings resulted in a few rows with the French kids. I remember once going out to play. Several French classmates were talking about their servants at home and saying, "All Annamites are thieves." I heard this. I couldn't remain silent. I went up and asked, "What did you just say?" That startled the French kids. I threw them even more off guard when I tossed aside my school bag and started pounding on them. Just then, my younger siblings came along. They joined the fray to back me up. A scuffle occurred in which, fortunately, no one suffered any injury worth describing. The next day, the principal called me in. I thought he would discipline me. but he gave me only a light reminder about proper behavior. At the end of the previous year, my mother had gone to Saigon for treatment when her illness became serious. She was staying at Grandfather Phan's temple in a cow ward. After finishing my brevet general education examination, I left for Saigon to visit my mother. I saw my mother's pale face. She was only skin and bones, and felt deep love for her and still more regret that I had not been by her side to take care of her. I cried until my eyes were swollen. Mother looked at me and shook her head, mumbling, "My beloved child." She said, "You're still so little." I was tired from a full day's journey from Phnom Penh to Saigon. Exhausted, I fell asleep. Then suddenly our helper shook me awake, saying my mother had just died. At that time, my father was far away on a work assignment, but he returned in time for my mother's funeral. Like my father, my siblings also had no chance to visit our mother during her last moments. I was the only one fortunate enough to see my mother before she passed on forever. We buried her at the Central Region Fraternal Association Cemetery, Trung Hai Hieu. Only in 1976, after the two wars, could we exhume her remains and move her to Grandfather Phan's temple, where she now rests. Before my mother's death, I had dreamed that, upon completing my baccalaureate, I would apply to medical school and become a doctor so that I could cure my mother and treat the poor. I had those thoughts and desires because I had seen the way the doctors treated my mother. Even though these doctors were paid, they were neither earnest nor dedicated. Our family had to beg them for favors. Could it be, perhaps, that we were unable to connect with effective and knowledgeable doctors? And so, I lost my mother when I was 16. My siblings were still very young, just 13, 9, 5, 3, and the youngest only a few months old. While my mother was still alive, I thought only about school and having fun. My father placed many hopes in me. I was a good student, especially in mathematics, where I always scored high marks. Later on, I tutored. For a time, I taught math at several schools. Try to study well, my father would always say, so that later you can have a profession and also care for your younger siblings. It was as if he foresaw our situation. During my high school years, I did study hard and began to think about the future. I loved to read. I would stay up very late reading novels. I also enjoyed listening to the lyrical music of Schubert, Schumann, and other composers, and to grand symphonies. I felt my heart awaken when I heard the song that Liu Hu Fook had written, calling on us youth. Oh, youth, stand up. Respond to the call of our nation. My parents had sometimes taken us to watch a movie or Si Kai Luong, Vietnamese modern opera. These stories stirred me. I recall watching Doi Ko Liu, Miss Liu's Life, a Kai Luong production which was very famous during the 1940s. Members of the audience turned from looking at the stage and stared at me. I was utterly embarrassed, but I could not restrain my tears. I also love sports. My favorite was basketball. I usually played with friends all Sunday morning. By the time I returned home, my cheeks were as red as ripe tomatoes. Sometimes I competed in basketball games with other schools or in cross-country races. I paid attention to sewing and cooking as well, since I wanted to become a woman accomplished in industry, appearance, speech, and good behavior. Like so many girls, I had many dreams. At that time, I met Kang, who would later become my life partner. Beginning in 1944, the situation in our country underwent many vicissitudes. It was as if the atmosphere were smoldering hot, with the forecast vague, yet auguring the changes that everyone awaited with worry and excitement. Japanese troops had poured into our country and spread throughout. At this time, I also began to become more aware of many other socio-political concerns. Activities of the Association of Overseas Vietnamese Patriots and then of the movement to assist compatriots starving in the northern region attracted the widespread involvement of Vietnamese living in Cambodia and particularly in Phnom Penh. Of course, members of my family were enthusiastic participants. Gradually, we came to understand about the Viet Minh, the organization that had stepped forward to launch these movements. The Japanese overturned the French administration in Indochina on March 9, 1945. Many Vietnamese in Cambodia felt they should return home as soon as possible to join directly in our country's huge struggle. Our family also decided to return home, and so I put aside preparations for my baccalaureate examination. I'm a happy person. I must speak about my private affairs because, truly, emotional ties have been the most precious part of my life. When I was 16, my father was working for the Geophysical Survey Office in Cambodia. A number of graduates from the Public Works Department in the Hanoi Polytechnic School came to Cambodia for internship assignments. Since my father held the most senior position in his profession in Cambodia, he received the assignment to guide them. Among these young interns was Mr. Din Kang, the graduate who worked most closely with my father. Older brother, Kang loved sports and was equally good at playing table tennis, volleyball, and basketball. We would often meet on the basketball court. Romance blossomed between us and grew in strength day by day. However, my father was cautious because he didn't know Kang's family. In addition, my father wanted me to complete my schooling. At that time, I had a number of other male friends, but my love was only for Kang. We made promises to each other. When the War of Resistance against France broke out, I went to Saigon to look for Kang and his friends. They had already returned to Saigon and were participating in the organizations that had been started by the Viet Minh. In the middle of 1946, Kang and I met again at Phan Chau Trin's temple. Kang stayed with our family for a few months and then left for Hanoi. Before his departure, he told me, I must go to the northern region and join our national army, where I have many friends. The situation in the southern region is very complex. It's difficult to know what to do. We parted and promised to see each other soon. It was 9 years before we were reunited in 1954, after I had regrouped to the north. During those 9 long years, I received from Kang only these few words, wishing you and your family safety and health. He had written them on a scrap of paper, which was crumpled because a member of a delegation of officials had hand-carried the note from our central-level headquarters in the northern region to the southern region. Could I consider that scrap of paper a letter? Regardless, I was delighted to know that Kang was alive and still thinking of me. Once, when my father was reading an engineering magazine sent undercover from the northern region, he found an article by an author named Din Kang. That's how my father discovered that his son-in-law in the northern region was an army engineer. I was organizing undercover for the resistance in Saigon's inner city and often went out to the liberated resistance zones to work and attend meetings. The comrade leaders of our movement showed concern for me and urged me to reconsider the commitment that Kang and I had made to wait for each other. Should I continue to wait? In truth, at that time, we did not know when our resistance war against France would be victorious. I didn't know when Kang and I might meet again. I told myself that if I found someone whom I loved more than Kang, then I would reconsider. In truth, up until that point, Kang had been the only one I cherished. In late 1949, a delegation from the southern region was about to be dispatched to our central headquarters in the northern region. My fellow sisters in the revolution loved me dearly and knew my story. They asked me if I wanted to go. I thought about this for a long time before replying that I couldn't leave. I realized that, without me, Kang could find someone else. However, I was afraid that, Without me, my younger siblings would have great difficulties. I will never regret that decision. Watching my 5 siblings mature was my reward for the love I gave them. Later, they became a great source of moral and spiritual support, and they remain so today. The Geneva Agreement was signed after 9 years of the resistance war against France. On November 23, 1954, I left to regroup in the north. My father was already in Hanoi. I met Kang again. My father had told me that Kang still did not have a wife and was working with the Army engineers. The day Kang and I met, I was deeply moved to see him in his Army green uniform. He gave me a penetrating look. "How are you?" he asked quietly. He probably perceived me as thinner, since I had been released from prison only a few months before. I will never forget those moments. We rushed to get married, because I was supposed to return to Saigon in 2 months to continue organizing. On December 1st, 1954, we had a frugal wedding with several plates of biscuits, candies, and cigarettes, plus tea. Our wedding was at number 2 Dinh Le Street, then the Ministry of Labor. Minister Nguyen Thi served as master of ceremonies. Especially touching was the emotional speech my father had prepared with great care. He recalled our story, how Kang and I had endured a very long separation, but had waited faithfully. He urged us to love each other until our hair turned silver and our teeth grew loose. Whether we are a father or a mother, we always love our children. When they are young, we nourish and teach them. Once they're grown, we still worry. We worry about whether they'll be happy. My father was like that. His nourishment, concern, and love made me always strive to succeed in whatever I was doing. I wanted my father to be pleased and proud of his daughter. Unfortunately, my father had passed on by the time I'd received important assignments and had completely fulfilled the responsibilities assigned to me. I'm a happy person. I was able to marry the man I loved. My first love. Because of our different assignments, Kang and I were often separated. However, the deep-rooted love between us helped me to stand firm and complete my missions. In 1956, I gave birth to Tang, Victory, our son, and then in 1960 to my Apricot or Plum, our daughter. As the American war grew fiercer by the day, I had to be separated from my children whenever I took on distant diplomatic missions. My comrades would ask me, "What has been your greatest difficulty in completing the huge tasks the party and state have assigned you?" The difficulties were not few, and the responsibilities I received were always greater than my strength. Many comrades were probably like me. At that time, when our country was totally committed to fighting the enemy, we could not refuse any task that the resistance and the nation asked of us. However, one important difficulty I could not overcome was my one sacrifice, not taking care of my 2 children. From age 2 onward, they had to live in creches and could come home only once a week. Whenever I was away, their uncles would pick them up, but if all the uncles were busy, then the children would remain at school. When my children were older, I was away all year and had to send Tang and my to a live-in school. Then, with the war raging, the children were evacuated with their aunt. Since their father was in the army, he also could not look after them. While on missions away from the city, I would hear bombs falling near the area where my children had been evacuated. I was so worried. I felt as if my heart would burst, for I loved them intensely. War divided our country for more than 20 years. My deepest sympathy goes to my sisters and brothers who were, like me, interminably separated from their children. All of us were unable to give our children the parental love and teaching they deserved. In wartime, many people must sacrifice, for there is no other choice. As to my own family while I was growing up, I must speak first about my father. My mother died very young, when my father was only 42. He loved his children and, Given the situation of the resistance struggle, he did not remarry. Now looking back, I believe my father's hardships probably would have lessened if he'd had someone to take care of him when he was ill while we children were all away. My father had the courage to express his convictions. People say that during the land reform campaign, he dared stand up to protect people who had been unfairly accused. He was in good physical shape from his work as a surveyor. He would cross jungles and wade streams as if such treks were nothing. However, with advancing age, he became ill perhaps because the enemy had arrested and tortured him many times. Then he served as head of the Southern Military Engineers who were operating deep in the southern forests with contaminated water. He had to stay in a hospital about 6 months. In 1969, I returned home from the Paris conference to receive new directives and was terribly distressed to find that my father had been in the hospital for several months. He was frail and emaciated. I embraced him. Between tears, I asked, "Why didn't you tell me you were ill?" My father's answer touched me. "My illness is minor," he said. "Your work now is far more important." That was my father's disposition. He loved his children dearly, but he was always also thinking about shared work. He was proud that the whole family participated in the resistance. I remember that during those cruel years, my father followed closely the situation in the southern battlefields. He heard news that our relatives were massacred and wept. He heard news that our soldiers were victorious and wept. By that time, 4 of us children were in North Vietnam, but the younger brother closest in age to me was active organizing undercover in South Vietnam. My father was always talking about about not knowing how was. In 1968, we heard that had been arrested. This came as a terrible shock to my father. The sad truth is that never again met our father, who died in 1969 when the war was still far from over. Was exiled to Con Dao political prison island, where he was held continuously until the liberation of South Vietnam in 1975. Only then was able to return home. On May 1st, 1975, our forces liberated Con Dao Prison Island. Boats from the mainland went out to meet our brothers and sisters who had been prisoners. We siblings met again after 20 years of separation. We hugged with endless joy while also repeatedly speaking of our father. If our father had still been alive, his joy would have been indescribable. During all those war years, like so many other families with each person in a different place, we had few chances to meet. Younger brother next in line to went to study in China from 1953 until 1958, when he returned home, but then he and Ho left for the Soviet Union as graduate students. Lone, my younger sister, studied in China from 1961 until 1966. Only the youngest, went into the army. He was so thin, but he hiked the entire Ho Chi Minh Trail and stayed in the ranks for 6 or 7 years before returning home. And Ho were not present when our father passed away in 1969 and could not accompany him to his final resting place. Only Kang and my 2 children were there. I heard that my son, Tang, mourned my father the most. Perhaps this was because Tang had been living for a long time with his grandfather and had witnessed firsthand the harsh and exhausting toll of my father's old age and illness even as he continued caring for 2 grandchildren. Work usually kept me far from my family, but I felt as if I had them each and all nearby, closely bound to me as the force driving me during every task I undertook. It would be true to say that I've had a rather strange life. I can't separate the influence and love of my family from my life's path with its many hard places. The members of my family were and are the strength and happiness of my life. Forged during the resistance war against France. In July 1945, our whole family was together in Saigon. Any Vietnamese who lived through that period will recall how everyone wanted to follow the call of our homeland. My father immediately joined Eastern Group Number 1, since that's where his friends were. As for me, I did whatever the leaders asked. One day in late September, our leaders requested that I go to the Saigon Municipal Theater to meet Comrade Ha. I expected an imposing revolutionary. But instead Ha was a rather young man, only about 30 years old. Later, I learned that he was an agricultural engineer who had joined the Viet Minh early on. Comrade Ha had heard that I knew English. The first task he assigned me was to welcome representatives of the British and Indian forces arriving in Saigon on behalf of the Allies to disarm the occupying Japanese. The Allies representatives whom I met were mostly British. The Indians and French Foreign Legion soldiers were only guards. I had never spoken English with someone from Great Britain. I was terribly embarrassed. I winced most when the British officers asked me about dancing and entertainment sites and matters about which I was completely ignorant. After several days, I requested release from my assignment. Comrade Ha gave me another task, which I now know to be intelligence work. I was to follow individuals to see where they went and what they did. I was equally abysmal at following and investigating. July and August of 1945 had been an animated time in Saigon. People and vehicles bustled about night and day. Young vanguard pioneers practiced marching 1-2-1-2 and singing to the streets by Lu Hu Phuc. The atmosphere suggested imminent uprising. People were out in the streets in large numbers, yet everything was orderly. It was as if we were feeling the steamy breath of something hugely important about to burst forth. Everyone was in the streets again on the morning of September 2nd. I went with Ha and Hai, the older two of my younger brothers, to the square at Notre Dame Cathedral. Something tremendous was about to occur. For the first time, representatives of the revolution's administration were going to appear in public. Across the country, the Viet Minh had seized political power from France and Japan. The Viet Minh in Saigon had established the city's Provisional Administrative Committee, which was our own city government run by Vietnamese belonging to the revolution. That afternoon, we were waiting to hear the speech that was to be broadcast from Hanoi by the country's new president, Ho Chi Minh, when guns at the French priest's house fired into the throng. Masses of people who had assembled peacefully turned into an uprising. A tense atmosphere surged across the city. Clearly, the French colonizers could not bear to withdraw. They were using any method, including war, to reoccupy Vietnam. Within 3 weeks, as soon as the Allies' troops arrived, we saw that the British and Indian armies were helping the French army return. British and Indian troops guarded the city's access points. They had not come to disarm the Japanese army. Instead, they were in Saigon to stop our struggle. The Viet Minh forces switched to alternative tactics. I received orders to carry pistols from the inner city to the outskirts. We were all fervently fulfilling our tasks regardless of danger. Everyone, particularly the youth, thought of only 2 words, independence and freedom. Those 2 words, independence and freedom, how sacred they were. On September 23rd, the French army publicly provoked hostilities with the Viet Minh. Gunfire erupted throughout Saigon. My father left as a liaison with men in Group B, while I stayed with my younger siblings at Elder Phan's temple in Dachau Ward. We could hear gunfire all around. Hi. And I decided to retrieve the pistol my father had left at the temple. We agreed that, if need be, we would shoot. We were determined that the French would not arrest us. Fortunately, the French only passed by. We did not need to use the pistol. The truth is that none of us had ever held a gun let alone fired one, including all my subsequent years in the resistance. I still haven't learned how to shoot a gun. Several days later, the local population began evacuating from the city's center to its outskirts and the provinces. Our family evacuated to Lithiu, where a cousin had a farm. My younger siblings remained there, while my father and we 3 older children joined the resistance, each of us with an assignment. My 4th and youngest brother, Nguyen Thi, was very small but brave. My father dispatched him and others to Cambodia with TNT sticks for the munitions workshop recently set up to produce grenades and mines. Another brother and I left for Honggu in Dong That province to haul food to our armed forces preparing to resist in the eastern zone. Mikusin in Saigon, Hong, Gong, Nong, and others also joined the resistance. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. My father's perfectionist anger would occasionally frighten us, but in fact, he was very gentle. After my mother passed away, my father paid much more attention to my life. He encouraged me to study, to take care of my siblings and play sports, but he would not allow me to organize at night. But then the Viet Minh assigned me to work at Hong Ngo in logistical supply for our soldiers. My 3rd brother, Hao, had already left for Honggu, about 175 kilometers from Saigon. I would have to travel by night and alone. My father took me to the Saigon wharf. There, sampans were filling with passengers. My father asked around. He told me that my trip's first leg would take me to Mai Tho, where I would have to find a sampan leaving for Honggu. My father worried about my traveling alone, but assignments for our country took priority. I was also worried. Up until that moment, nothing had ever required that I be so brave. Yet when I saw that my father was of mixed minds, I reassured him, saying, "There's nothing to worry about, Father. I can do this." I climbed aboard the boat, which already had about 30 passengers ready to depart. They must have been local people from the 6 Delta provinces on their way back home from Saigon. Since I didn't know anyone, I sat huddled in one place and didn't sleep the whole night. Everyone disembarked at Mai Tho the following morning. I had never been to Mai Tho and didn't know whom to ask about a boat to Honggu. I walked around and around in the streets, searching for the Viet Minh office. Luckily, I ran into Comrade Ha, and then later I met an old friend from Cambodia. Before long, I was on my way to Honggu. I had a cousin who had been working in Honggu for a while. As soon as I arrived, I learned that local resistance activists had elected him president of the Hong Ngo District Resistance Committee. I was relieved to have arrived safely. Yet problems arose with my assignment to carry dried beef to the eastern zone. The day after I'd left my, though, provincial capital, the French occupied the city, and then they continued on, taking Sa Dec and Chao Da provinces. By now, the French had blocked the road to Saigon. I remained in Honggu, where I worked as secretary for the local resistance administrative committee. Since I was in the Honggu liberated area, I participated in the first general election in independent Vietnam. By January 6, 1946, we had completed all our local preparations for the nationwide elections. The people flocked to the People's Committee office to join this great event. Then we heard airplanes. People ran about, yelling, "Airplanes! Airplanes!" Bombs exploded. The French airplanes had arrived to destroy the elections. A dozen people were killed or wounded. Nevertheless, our general elections continued that afternoon. I stayed in Honggu until May 1946. By then, the French had occupied most cities and provincial capitals in southern Vietnam. Our resistance armed forces had withdrawn to the countryside, leaving only the undercover units behind in the cities. My father asked friends to guide my brother and me from Honggu back to Saigon. My entire family assembled at Elder Phan's temple but we could no longer organize openly. Many families, including my father's friends from Cambodia, were in the same situation. Friends without houses in Saigon came to live with us. During this time, we faced financial difficulties. My father had used his savings to build the Phnom Penh house, where relatives now lived. We took on every kind of paid work, even rinsing bottles at factories, to support everyone living with us in Dachau Ward. I decided to take advantage of a neighborhood near Elder Phan's temple. I opened a stall to sell rice, fish sauce, and miscellaneous goods, such as duck eggs, tomatoes, onions, and garlic. Several office functionaries and engineers joined my father as porters fetching rice and eggs from the Ka Ong land market for me to sell. The atmosphere in Saigon was tense and claustrophobic. People worried about how to secure food and other necessities for their daily lives. The city throbbed with anxiety about whatever might happen, for nothing seemed clear. Perhaps whatever was coming would be dangerous. Yet everyone was impatient with anticipation for whatever change might soon arrive. By the end of that year, all would be clear. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Even now, my younger siblings still enjoy telling the story of their elder sister selling tomatoes at Tan Din Market. Indeed, the best place to sell was Tan Din, which was over a kilometer from our house. My skills did not include carrying heavy baskets with a bamboo shoulder pole. After walking several dozen meters, I had to set the baskets down and switch shoulders. By the time I arrived at the market, I was soaked with sweat. A French soldier at the market collected taxes, while a French police officer following behind him scrutinized prices. One day, the friend who sold duck eggs next to me was haggling over prices with a half-French, half-Vietnamese woman. The state price was 16 cents per egg, but we had bought our eggs for more than 20 cents. We had to sell them for at least 25. The police officer managing prices intervened and forced my friend to sell several dozen eggs at the state price. My friend burst into tears. I could not restrain myself. I snapped in French at the police. This startled everyone. Even the French police and the half-French, half-Vietnamese woman were surprised. They looked at each other and left. The sisters in the market thanked me profusely. However, after that incident, the brothers and sisters in our resistance organization would no longer allow me to sell goods at Tan Din Market. By speaking French, I had blown my own cover as an underground organizer. At the end of 1946, many families with their homeland in Vietnam's northern region, Bac Khai, Tonkin, sought a way to return to Hanoi since the French had not yet occupied our capital. However, it was not long before the nationwide resistance broke out. The fires of war leapt across the entire country. Early in 1947, the French army began using its forces for terror and suppression to reinforce its control. It ran constant scouring sweeps at night in Saigon, arresting organizers in the resistance. French troops rummaged through Elder Phan Chau Trin's temple at 13 Gallimard Street. Now, Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter, they arrested and tortured my father. We children felt deep love for our father. We worried about him. Each time the police arrested our father, our hatred for the French grew. By the end of 1947, my father could no longer stay in the city. He received orders from the resistance organization to leave for the mangrove swamps. I received a directive to remain behind, organize for the resistance, and tutor for money to feed my siblings. After a while, friends in the Viet Minh realized I was always at Elder Phan's temple. They pointed out that my presence there could easily expose our network. I had to slip away to another site. I made up my mind to ask an older cousin, a patriotic businessman, to tidy up his affairs, move to the temple, and live with my younger siblings. I felt such love for my younger brothers and sister, but I had no other choice. I could only drop by now and then to visit them. One time, I returned to find my youngest brother with a high fever. He was huddling under grandfather's altar. I felt beset by pity. At times, I felt I should stop and care for my younger siblings. I had to repress those feelings to continue my organizing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Work as a private tutor covered our expenses during my clandestine organizing in Saigon. I'd had teaching experience in mathematics with students at an exam training center and, for a while, had taught at Colette School, where the curriculum was in French. The principal was a friend. Older sister now. Most of the students were the children of wealthy business owners or officials from the Saigon administration. At the end of 1946, the resistance assigned me to organize for the Association of Women for National Salvation, beginning with Neighborhood 5, the area where my family lived. Subsequently, I received an appointment to the city's Association of Women for National Salvation. Sisters organizing with me at that time are Na, Hugh Bitch, Dat Han, and Tu Kio, but I was closest to Due Lin. She and I were the same age. Due Lin was lively, sharp-witted, and looked younger than her years. The police arrested us both several years later, in April 1951. Due Lin gave her age as 6 years younger, making her a teenager. The enemy fell for her ruse. In 1946, the two older sisters working with us were Bei Hu, my first mentor in the resistance, and later the wife of Nguyen Van Lin, and Chin Chow. I was very fond of Bei Hu, who was gentle, upright, and caring. She made careful recommendations and went to unnecessary lengths so that I would understand important points about relating to ordinary people. She would say to the other women, Yin, that was the alias she had given me, is a student. She has just finished school and does not yet know anything. She needs your help. It is true that I participated with all the enthusiasm of youth. I wanted to add my small part to the common struggle, even though I did not know the least thing about politics. The sisters in the resistance assigned me to live with a farming family in Tan, Pudong on the outskirts of Saigon, so that I could learn about organizing among ordinary people. Every day, I swept the fallen leaves in the huge orchard, cooked the rice, boiled the water, and so on. The grandmother was head of the household. She belittled me for not knowing how to cook and tidy up the house. I decided that working for the resistance was not easy. However, after several months, the family, even the grandmother, began to treat me with affection. I received an introduction to Comrade Hong Quoc Tan, who was part of a Marxist cell in Saigon. Several French communists joined the cell meetings. I borrowed books on Marxism-Leninism and read about dialectical materialism, but my understanding was fragmented. I gradually gathered some knowledge about the revolution through meetings with brothers and sisters returning to the city from the resistance zone and through my occasional trips out to the mangrove swamps for large meetings. I tried to transfer whatever I had learned to the brothers and sisters in my unit. Whenever I spoke with the students for whom I was responsible, I would bring in new points and ways of teaching, which the students welcomed. I also campaigned among my acquaintances. At that time, I would refer to Bui T. Cam, a lawyer and the wife of a famous intellectual, as older sister, using a somewhat intimate term even though she was far older. She asked me what she should do for the resistance. I said, you and your husband can look for whatever is useful for the resistance and then do it. Don't do anything that isn't useful. Even though my response was simple, she was effusive in her thanks. Younger sister, she said, you're so right. I realized that everyone has at least latent patriotism. Sometimes, a statement as simple as my response may reveal huge truths and be a catalyst changing a person's life. Older sister Cam subsequently joined the resistance and later held important positions. In addition to assignments, mobilizing and educating the populace, my friends and I distributed propaganda leaflets and encouraged strikes to oppose the enemy's schemes and cruelty. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In 1948, Comrade Hoback from the District Party Steering Committee came to visit me, saying the district-level comrades had evaluated my organizing as zealous and had decided to receive me into the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party. He briefed me on the party and Ho Chi Minh as president of the state and of the party. I found this very interesting, but asked for time to consider. To my thinking, party membership was for model revolutionaries prepared to sacrifice for ideals. After some time, I agreed. The two people who formally introduced me, Nguyen Thi Binh and Gomat Ho Thi Chi, the wife of Comrade Hahui, Zap. In 1946, the Fontainebleau Conference failed. Our patient efforts to avoid war had not been successful. President Ho Chi Minh stayed on in Paris to negotiate a modus vivendi, a temporary but official diplomatic agreement pending settlement of a dispute in September. Nevertheless, 2 months after he returned to Hanoi, the French attacked Haiphong. President Ho's speech to the entire nation on December 19th, 1946, at that crucial point expressed our people's profound aspirations and determination. We want peace. We must make concessions. But the more concessions we make, the more the French colonizers invade. They are determined to steal our country once again. No, we will sacrifice everything. We will not tolerate the loss of our country. We will not be slaves. In Saigon, the resistance movement under the People's Committee and party leadership burst forth across all the social strata. The leadership assigned me to take charge of political training for core student groups in addition to mobilizing women. Among those students was Ben Tan, an excellent activist from the Marie Curie School. We bonded immediately and became close friends. Later, during my diplomatic missions, Ben Tan served as my personal assistant and secretary. In addition to our organizing among workers and small traders, Du Wei Lin and I received assignments to mobilize bourgeois intellectual women. For me, this was difficult because these women were accustomed to a casual, free lifestyle they could not easily adjust to the rigorous life of an activist. Many times, in the middle of a meeting, we would hear a car horn. The women would jump up and rush out to dine with their husbands in Cholon. Yet these sisters were patriotic. After participating in our mobilizing activities, they agreed to join the Association of Progressive Women. I will always remember older sister Han, a doctor, and older sister Nguyen Hoa, who later became Minister of Health for the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam. When Nguyen Hoa left Saigon for the resistance base, the Saigon administration confiscated all her belongings and sentenced her to death in absentia. In 1949, Du Wei Lin and I received an introduction to a cell led by Nguyen Thi Binh. Students who had just finished school went to the offices of this very famous lawyer, who was among the 20th century's greatest Vietnamese intellectuals. Du Wei Lin and I arrived, all aflutter. We were completely out of our element. The office was elegant and luxurious, while the lawyer was tall and handsome. He smiled graciously as he welcomed us. From that point onward, my fate and my life were linked closely to the life of this man of great intellect, this best of comrades. Our cell also included older sister Tam Lu as cell secretary, an experienced revolutionary. She had taken part in the Southern Uprising of 1940. The general secretary of the City Party Committee at that time was Comrade Nguyen Van Lin. Along with Nguyen Thi, though, I must also speak of Dr. Pham Ngoc Thach, Nguyen Thi Phat, and the many other Southern intellectuals whom I knew during my years as an activist. For the most part, they were wealthy, people of high social station. But when faced with the revolution and our country's huge needs, they discarded everything and threw themselves into the shared resistance struggle, contributing their extraordinary intelligence to the nation. To my thinking, the dominant characteristic of the Vietnamese intelligentsia at that time was the wealth of their patriotism. Indeed, the intelligentsia was the quintessence of patriotism. I have great respect and affection for those comrades. We soon saw that our undercover activism would be insufficient unless we expanded the movement. We needed to bring our people out into open struggle under many forms, both legal and illegal. Organizers formed many groups, such as the Association of Progressive Women, the Association to Assist Victims of the Tan Quin Fire, plus organizations of workers, university students, high school students, etc. Every stratum of society had its public, legal organization. The body representing these organizations was the Coordinating Committee of Organizational Representatives, which was headed by Nguyen Thi Binh. At the end of 1949, the enemy arrested a number of students at Petrusk High School. A protest erupted at the school, demanding the arrested students' release. The enemy responded with a further terror of arrests. Police rounded up all students who had protested. On January 9, 1950, several thousand students from across the city marched toward the official residence of French-backed Governor Tran Van Hue in the Botanical Gardens on La Grandière Street, now Lai Tu Trong Street. They held aloft banners with the slogan, "Free the arrested Petrusk High students." Many supporters joined their march. The students had selected representatives to meet Governor Tran Van Hue, but he closed his doors and refused to see any of them. At midday, the police arrived in dozens of vehicles with several hundred soldiers to repress the demonstration. The students tried to resist, but couldn't. Nguyen Van Nguyen, a student leader, blocked the road so that other students could escape. The police beat Tran Van Nguyen with their cudgels and shot him dead when he tried to scramble over a hedge. Tran Van Nguyen fell backwards. News of the demonstration and of Tran Van Nguyen's martyrdom spread like flames throughout Saigon. Indignation erupted into anger. Tran Van Nguyen's death was the spark igniting a firestorm. On January 12, 1950, Tran Van Nguyen's funeral became a colossal demonstration drawing people from all classes in Saigon, Cho Lan. Many people came from My Tho province, and even from Bac Lu and Can Tho provinces farther south in the Mekong Delta. The Coordinating Committee of Organizational Representatives, with Nguyen Thi Binh as its head, had sent many proposals to the Saigon administration, demanding that the authorities end their terror and release all the students and everyone they had arrested in connection with the demonstration. Open organizations and undercover organizations met frequently to plan their opposition to the enemy. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Then we heard that on March 19th, 1952, American ships, the command ship Stickwell and the destroyer Anderson, would land at Saigon. Here was public evidence of American intervention to assist the French colonizers, who were facing difficulties on every front. The Saigon Party Committee organized a working committee to direct widespread opposition to the French colonizers' invasion and the American imperialists' intervention. At the same time, we would oppose the enemy's repression and terror, which increased daily in the cities. I was appointed representative for women on the demonstration's organizing committee. We mobilized in preparation for a workers' strike and a huge demonstration on March 19th. At 8 o'clock that morning, crowds gathered at Tan Tho Tuong School. Just as Nguyen Thi Binh and comrades from the Coordinating Committee of Organizational Representatives were arriving. The openly organized groups tossed flyers from the school's top-floor windows. The flyers, which demanded that the enemy cease its terror, fell like welcomed rain. Nguyen Thi Binh had not begun to speak when police vehicles arrived. People pushed out to fill the street and block the police with everyone, marching in the direction of the Saigon market. Nguyen Thi Binh and many famous Saigon intellectuals led the march, along with a Frenchwoman who was married to Comrade Pham Huy Thong. The comrades heading the trade union delegation stretched out the red banners they had prepared beforehand. Wherever the trade union leaders went, bystanders holding aloft red flags with gold stars surged into the street and followed like waves of water in a flood. Our flags flew, dignified and dauntless, right there in the middle of enemy-occupied Saigon. Many people could not restrain their tears. According to the organizing committee's plan, wings of demonstrators would approach the municipal theater from different directions and then pour out to the wharf, where the 2 American ships were due to dock. In fact, the 2 ships had already arrived but did not dare approach the wharf. Instead, they anchored at a distance. The demonstrators coming from Ton, Tho Tuong, formed the primary wing. I accompanied that group. We had divided the organizing committee, with each of us following a wing. However, we were undercover as leaders. Aus Mango, Namsu, Duilin, and myself was so engrossed in the momentum that we had a hard time sticking to discipline. At this point, we were still on Lu Loi Street in front of the municipal theater. A huge American flag appeared from the second floor of the U.S. government's Saigon office. I had just arrived. I saw several young men climbing up onto each other's shoulders to snatch the flag. I looked around. I knew undercover secret police agents were nearby. I shouted, "Protect those brothers!" The youths yanked the American flag free. The crowd tore to pieces. The young men had just jumped down when secret police agents arrived and nabbed them. I did not have time to think. I knew only that if I did nothing, the French police would arrest the youths. I jumped in and grabbed the hand of the secret police unit's commander, twisting his wrist. This gave the youths just enough time to escape. The youths kept running while the police commander shook his wrist, recovering from shock. The youths ducked into the crowd, darting this way, that way until they disappeared. I realized I was also in danger. The crowd was seething. I darted into the throng where it was thickest. Our crowd pressed toward the town hall. Another clash with the police ensued. I never heard whether the French commander's wrist was injured, but the demonstrators did set his vehicle afire, turning it into a charred frame. We pushed onto the river, shouting, "Down with the invading French colonizers! Down with the intervening Americans!" The purpose of the demonstration was to show our flag and instill spirit for opposing the American imperialists' aid to the French colonizers. Faced with the advancing masses of people, the 2 American ships hastened to weigh anchor and steam away. Some people estimated that nearly 500,000 people had joined that demonstration. Yet the population of Saigon was only 1 million. However, it did seem to me as if all the city's occupants were in the streets. The enemy administration remained paralyzed for hours. We said to each other, if only we'd had weapons, we could have seized political power. There are so many unforgettable anecdotes about that demonstration on March 19th, 1950. As our wing moved from Ton, Tho Tuong out toward Ben Ton Market, we met the train en route from Saigon to My Tho. The railway workers stopped the train, jumped down, and joined our march. In another wing, the police threw tear gas grenades. Many demonstrators fainted. Residents living on both sides of the street brought out pails of water and ice. They took the injured inside for first aid. Wherever the French arrested demonstration leaders, the throng would protect other activists so they could escape. After the police officers recovered, they began sweeps throughout the city to pursue us. First, they arrested Nguyen Thi, though, to answer for his crimes. However, the police could not intimidate him, and the Coordinating Committee of Organizational Representatives, which he led, Nguyen Thi, though, exposed the enemy's cruelty. He said the people's indignation was legitimate and that the administration's repression and terror had forced the people to rise up in opposition. A few months later, the authorities exiled Nguyen Thi, though, to Lai Chau province in the far north. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Other demonstrations burst forth in Saigon. In April 1950, the enemy burned a hamlet of thatch houses at Tan Kien in the Bon Co area of workers' housing that served as one of our undercover resistance bases in the inner city. The authorities wanted to drive the people into another area. Several hundred families lost their houses, possessions, and what little capital they had accumulated. The French repression had forced them to live on reed mats under the open sky. The Coordinating Committee of Organizational Representatives strongly condemned the enemy's scheme and demanded that the enemy assist the local people. The legally open trade unions organized drives to raise funds to help the victims. This was also an occasion to continue encouraging the masses of people to join the struggle. On May 12, 1950, the enemy arrested and murdered Tran Boi Ko, a female ethnic Chinese student. Comrade Lin and I were responsible for organizing in the ethnic Chinese community. We received an assignment to set up a meeting in Cho Lan to denounce this cruelty and call on the ethnic Chinese to join with ethnic Vietnamese in opposing the aggressors and in protecting our youth. Once again, I made a mistake. I did not follow strict discipline and allowed the police to learn my identity. The brothers and sisters had set a table alongside a crowded Cho Lan Street. At precisely the predetermined time, a young ethnic Chinese man jumped onto the table to speak. I looked around and saw that no one was guarding him. I called on several people to surround him. He held forth for about 5 minutes before the police arrived. The police arrested several people on site. Nevertheless, the meeting created indispensable echoes. Other echoes from struggles outside the city reached the enemy's prisons. In July 1950, brothers and sisters incarcerated at the Saigon Interrogation Center staged a hunger strike to oppose the prison's harsh treatment and to support demands made by compatriots outside the prison. The resistance leaders asked me to organize a demonstration by families of prisoners held at the center, and particularly to mobilize the sisters whose husbands were prisoners. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The year 1950 was especially notable for the ebullience of the Saigon Cho Lan movement. I cannot remember all the demonstrations that we organized. These actions led our revolutionary brothers and sisters to call us the demonstration advisors. Indeed, we were ardent. We threw ourselves into those demonstrations. At that time, we heard about preparations for a general, nationwide counteroffensive. This encouraged us to increase our actions. I was elected president of the City Women's Union and party general secretary for the Unit of Women for National Salvation. The responsibilities were exacting, while my family responsibilities also brought increased worries. 2 of my siblings had left for resistance zones, but I still had 3 younger siblings at home, as well as my cousins. I had to stop by home frequently to tend to them. These demonstrations occurred as battlefields across the country were generating important changes. The autumn 1950 border campaign of the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, liberated 3 northern border provinces, Chao Bang, Bac Can, and Lang Son. This inspired the movement of the people's opposition in Saigon, Cholon. The French added to their terror in Saigon. We activists received orders to conceal ourselves and protect our forces. This was the period when the police arrested the greatest number of activists in the inner city. I received orders to go out to the work site for our most important comrades, such as Dr. Pham Ngoc Thach and architect Nguyen Thi Phat, in the Administrative Committee for the Resistance. Previously, I had gone on assignments to the key resistance zone and had worked on the newspaper Chong Xam Lang, Oppose Aggression, even though I had no journalistic skills. Later, I went to another guerrilla zone, to Area 8, for meetings of the Women's Union of the South. There I met revolutionary women leaders, including Nguyen Thi Thap, for whom I later served as secretary. Tu Ding, Le Thi Zing Tam Tang, Mui Hui, and O Te. Each woman influenced me in her own way. Each one enlarged my vision and understanding. Each one helped me become even more determined. None of these women is still alive, but for me, their images live on in my memory. While in the guerrilla zone, I visited my father in Dong Thap Muoi province. There, he served as head of the Southern Military Engineers. The party committee for the South called me to its office. For the first time, I met the high-level comrades who had come to southern Vietnam from the party's central level in the Northern Liberated Zone. They included Cô Ma Lê Duẩn, Lê Đức Thọ, and Pham Hung. I had always thought these comrades would be humorless and even-hardened, but I found them easygoing, friendly, and caring. I was pleased to meet them and to report on the pulse of the work we had done in the city. One of the comrades asked, "What's most interesting when you're organizing in the city?" Without thinking, I answered, "The demonstrations." They all laughed. I was able to learn from the comrades' discussion and advice. But my deepest impression came from careful instructions and their confidence in the path I was taking. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By the beginning of 1951, we needed to strengthen the opposition in the city through greater flexibility in our actions to avoid the enemy's scrutiny. I no longer worked with the women, but had moved over to responsibility for an intelligence team composed of Aunt Dad, older brother Din, and myself. At the same time, I served as secretary of the party Inner City Committee 4. Junior staff, Comrade Nguyen Kim chaired the committee. The situation was tense, with more arrests of comrades, such as Nguyen Kim, Duan Van, Bo, and others. I had been working on my new assignment for 3 months when, in April 1951, the secret police arrested me along with older brother Nguyen Tho Chan, Aunt Dad, and Due Lin. They jailed us in Catnap Police Station. That had been working in the town hall. She'd slipped out with enemy documents and personnel records. The police suspected Dat and arrested her. On her way home, the rest of us had been staying with Dat, using her as cover. Thus, the police arrested us as well. We were repeatedly tortured because the enemy viewed us as important cadres for the city party committee. From an informant, they knew that Comrade Nguyen Tho Chan had just returned from the party's central level in the Northern Liberated Zone, and so they were especially ruthless when torturing him. As for myself, I was cruelly beaten without stopping because an earlier arrestee had broken under torture and given my name. First, they tortured with savage beatings, then by submerging me in water, then with electricity, then I want to die, so they would finish. I was most worried about breaking under torture and giving names, leading the enemy to arrest others. I decided I would accept whatever the enemy said about me, but my one purpose was to say nothing else. After a time, the torturers saw they could not wrest any information from me. The documents they had collected provided evidence that I had worked as a spy. In the end, they concluded that I was a spy and should receive a heavy sentence. Catinat Detention Center was the heart of the secret police in Indochina. I witnessed with my own eyes evidence of the fiendish savagery of the colonized hirelings. Without regret, they beat us to make us confess. They did not care whether their victims were men or women, old or young. They would use depraved tricks to humiliate us women. I had never thought it possible that human beings could be so cruel in so many ways. Years later, I met a number of friends who had been arrested again during the time of the Americans and their puppets. Those sisters told me that the cruelty of the Americans and their lackeys was many times worse than our experience under the French. Those who haven't experienced the imperialists' terrible prisons can nevertheless imagine in their own minds. Eyes the pain we suffered. While in prison, I witnessed models of bravery by the revolutionary warriors who died without surrendering. When I was taken to the interrogation room, I saw several secret police using cudgels and whips to flog a youth who was suspended upside down from the ceiling, his body covered with blood. The youth held to his goal of giving no information. From others, I learned that he had been assigned special tasks in the city. This staunch warrior, whose name I never learned, was beaten to death. I knew many other martyrs. We know there were countless other heroic martyrs, whose names we do not know. Catinat Detention Center was under the direction of Bazin, the notorious chief of the French secret police. This detention center, famous for its cruelty, was at the head of Catinat Street, later Tudu Street, Saigon's most luxurious street with many elegant, expensive shops and large hotels. Immediately in front of the Catinat Detention Center was Notre Dame Cathedral, the city's largest and most beautiful church. I do not understand what the French colonizers, to be more exact, the French secret police, were thinking when they chose that site for Catinat Detention Center. Late at night, we would return from the torture chamber to the special detention room. The ringing in our ears from the enemy's horrible whippings, beatings, dunkings, and electricity would be replaced by the vang-vang resounding echo of the Notre Dame bells. As if those bells wanted to lessen our pain. What an irony! After Catinat, they held me in Chi Hoa prison for 3 years. During that time, our resistance underwent major changes. Nguyen Thi Binh, he was once again the primary lawyer who would argue on our behalf. After several weeks in Saigon, he once again secured entry into Chi Hoa prison to visit a client. He let us know about the political and military situation outside and brought us nutritious food and even cakes and candy. The victory at Dien Bien Phu created a huge embarrassment for the enemy's army and simultaneously created favorable conditions for us. After I'd spent 3 years in prison, the enemy condemned me to 4 more years, but with a suspended sentence. I learned that people in Paris had intervened to lighten my sentence. They had been acquainted with my grandfather in the Human Rights League, while grandfather was an activist in Paris. I have only recently been able to verify this. One other detail is certain. Lawyer Nguyen Thi, though used all his zeal to advocate for me and other comrades before the French court. Du Wei Lin, my close friend, also worked in every possible way for my early release. I had heard from comrades arrested before me that French prisons were schools for revolutionaries. This was certainly true for me. Political prisoners did not allow themselves to waste time. We organized study, practice sessions in culture and politics. Many of the women were illiterate, but after a time, they learned to read and write. Most important of all, we learned from each other and matured in our struggle against the enemy by sharing our own experiences and those of the comrades who had gone before us. We organized sessions every day with balanced reports from Chi Hoa. Prison radio. These contain news from inside the prison and from outside society, news of the struggle, and news of the victories of our army and people from across the country. We demanded improvements in the prison system and also organized actions in response to the resistance movement outside the prison walls. At times, we organized hunger strikes for 6 consecutive days. In prison with us were resistance activists as well as criminals. After mixing with us, some criminals examined their mistakes and changed. A few of them later became serious participants in the resistance. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I will never forget 2 events, which occurred while I was in prison. My 4th younger brother, Dong Hao, had been studying at Nguyen Thi Binh School in Region 9. In 1952, the revolutionary leaders chose how to go out to the northern region and then on to study outside the country. Visitors to the prison needed special photo identification papers and could visit only every 2 weeks. In truth, I never thought that Hao would secretly change the photograph on his ID so that he could sneak in and see me before leaving. My family is like that. Our family and the homeland and the revolution were one and could not be split. Seeing my brother both delighted and worried me. We stared at each other for several minutes and spoke only a few words amidst the noise of the other prisoners and their visitors. Those few minutes will remain forever in both our memories. That night, I couldn't possibly sleep. I was so homesick. I longed for my father and my siblings. I heard only recently about the second event. My father was deeply sad when he learned of my arrest. After this news, his hair quite quickly turned white. I knew my father loved us deeply. He had always encouraged us to participate in the resistance. But my father also always worried about his children, particularly his 2 daughters. After my release from prison, I met my father again when he was preparing to go out to the north to join the Dien Bien Phu campaign. I was so distressed to find him much weaker than before. Upon my release from prison in April 1954, the higher level of the resistance wanted me to work in the guerrilla zone, but I was better suited to work in the inner city, where all my friends were active and where my youngest siblings were living. I asked for some time off and then to return to work. At the time of my release from prison, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was approaching its climax. The French, nearing defeat, were increasing their terror in the southern region. I had just re-established contact with comrades in the resistance organizations when the police arrested me again, because Elder Phan's temple remained a site the secret police scrutinized. This time, the colonial authorities arrested me as well as a cousin who was at the house. After 2 months, they released us since they had no evidence. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu ended with our victory on May 7th, 1954, but the French war did not end until after the Geneva Agreement was signed on July 20th, 1954. We celebrated the victory. Immediately thereafter, we received an order to organize the masses to welcome the agreement and demand its strict implementation. Nguyen Thi Binh, Lawyer Trin, Din Tao, Professor Pham Hui Thong, Professor Nguyen Van Duong, and other leaders organized the peace movement and the struggle to demand the agreement's implementation. Under Sita Damlu, Drillian, Hubich, and I took part. We organized many meetings to explain the agreement's points. On August 1st, 1954, the Special Police savagely repressed a large meeting, which the trade union had organized. The police used not only beatings, whippings, and electricity, but also shot directly into the crowd. Hugh Bitch, my close friend, was wounded. We found a doctor to care for her. For us, the ill intentions of the French after signing the agreement were clear right from the start. The ink on the agreement was not yet dry when the French tore up the document and threw away the scraps. The situation during the following days was chaotic. Our orders from above were to stay within legal limits in opposing the enemy. Then, shortly thereafter, the police arrested 3 key resistance leaders and sent them to prison in Haiphong in the northern region. As for the rest of us, we were forced to withdraw under cover. In October 1954, Comrade Pham Hung called me to Region 9. The comrades there asked that I tie up my work and join the United Ceasefire Delegation, which would be formed in Saigon and travel out to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. The work would be in the south and involve a ceasefire. They had chosen me because I was acquainted with the people and localities in Saigon. I requested 2 months to organize everything for my siblings' schooling and to take care of personal affairs. Comrade Pham Hung agreed. After I regrouped to the north with my 3 youngest siblings, I prepared to return to Saigon, but then learned that the ceasefire delegation had to drop several people. The delegation would no longer include a woman. Instead, they assigned me to work at the Central Level Women's Union in Hanoi. This began a new season in my life as an activist, and it concluded my 9 years in the resistance against French colonialism, a time that had tested and strengthened me. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I would like to say more about the story surrounding my legal case. In 1951, the French police arrested me and accused me of crimes against national security. Albert Sonnet of the Churit in Cochin, China, the southern region of Vietnam, signed a report which was forwarded to the Churit for all of Indochina. The report noted that I would be sentenced to death or life imprisonment. This alarmed our Saigon, Cho Lan leaders, who assigned lawyer Nguyen Thi Binh to follow my case, persuade the judges, and defend me in court. During that period, I also heard that activists in France, who had been acquainted with Phan Chau Trinh, my maternal grandfather, had found a way to intervene and reduce my sentence. However, I didn't know who was involved or how they had intervened. Then in 2001, my older cousin, Lu Thi Kin, a.k.a. Phan Thi Minh, went to the Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer, the colonial archives, at Aix-en Province in southern France to research the 14 Years' Hour. Grandfather was in Paris and the R. In the process of this research, she found several documents related to my case. Among these documents was a letter signed by Marius Matet, the Minister of Colonies who had signed the modus vivendi with President Ho on September 14, 1946, on the occasion of the official visit to France by Uncle Ho as the President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Marius Matet wrote his letter regarding my case on May 15, 1952, when he was no longer a minister in the French government, but instead a senator, that is, a member of the higher house in the French Parliament. He sent the letter to M. Letourneau, Minister of Associated States for the French government. The letter said, "I have learned that a young woman, age 23, who goes by the name of S.A. or Hassin, is held at Chi Hoa Detention Center in Saigon. Her case is about to be settled with the death penalty. This young woman is the granddaughter of someone whom I knew, M. Phan Chau Trinh, Vietnamese in both French-affiliated Vietnam and also among the revolutionary. Viet Minh regard Phan Chau Trinh as a patriotic scholar, as a hero of their people. I'm not clear about the accusations against this woman, but please allow me to suggest that both moral and political factors may lead to serious negative results if she is executed. Even though this case is in the Vietnamese court with a Vietnamese judge rendering judgment, people will say that this sentence was under French direction. It is my deep wish and hope that you will give this matter your greatest attention." Signed, Marius Matet. In addition to this letter, there were several official dispatches from the Office of the Minister for Associated States sent to the High Commissioner for Indochina and the secret police in the southern region of Vietnam regarding my case. The routes and results of Mr. Matet's intervention are unclear since we do not have all the relevant documents. Nevertheless, this leads me to return and speak about several other matters regarding my grandfather. Elder Phan Chau Trinh was among the scholars who took the initiative in the Due Tan movement, which was a progressive social movement at the beginning of the 20th century. He was arrested in 1908 and accused as a rebel who was instigating trouble. The royal court sentenced him to death. The 1908 arrest of Phan Chau Trinh led to a strong emotional outpouring and public discussion in Hanoi among patriotic Vietnamese and also among progressive French. Ernest Babbitt, a journalist and member of the French Human Rights League, Ligue de Droits de l'Homme, led the campaign in Hanoi to save Elder Phan. Marius Matet and a number of others in the Human Rights League in France were also dedicated supporters of Elder Phan. With their intervention, Elder Phan escaped execution. After that, during 14 years of exile in France, Elder Phan Chau Trinh continued his activities and was able to secure support from many Vietnamese living overseas and from progressive French people. Among them, in particular, was French Commandant Jules Roux. Years later, during the four-party talks with the United States in Paris, I searched for the families of Jules Roux and other friends of my grandfather, but unfortunately, I was never able to find anyone. Nevertheless, Elder Phan's reputation as a man with a patriotic spirit, a modernist will, and a strong moral presence throughout his life created continuing trust and love among his compatriots inside our country, as well as sympathy and admiration among international friends, particularly in France. Those feelings were so enduring that perhaps they abrogated the death sentence against one of Elder Phan's grandchildren. Perhaps Elder Phan passed along his deeds-earned benediction to rescue us all. A special front opposing the United States to save the nation. At the Central Level Women's Union in Hanoi, I worked as secretary to Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, the union's president. She was also the party general secretary of the Women's Mobilization Unit, a member of the party's Central Committee, and a member of the National Assembly. At first, this work was difficult because I was more familiar with secret, illegal, local organizing. In Hanoi, everything was completely different because my work was open. My tasks involved concentrating on each step, organizing the work myself, which meant usually making my own decisions and taking personal responsibility for those decisions. I worked with state offices, the National Assembly, the ministries, and the labor unions. All these offices were comfortably open. I was not acquainted with any of this. The Saigon authorities had recently released me from prison, and my health was poor. Working in this new environment tested me, but also provided new experiences and many additional lessons, which I learned quickly. I was fortunate, for my experiences during the years of struggle in Saigon had taught me to face every difficulty with a self-confident, unflinching approach. All of us working the National Women's Union affectionately called Madame Nguyen Thi Binh 10th older sister. In truth, 10th older sister was about my mother's age. Yet my relationship with Nguyen Thi Binh was both that of a secretary with the top leader and yet also that of a family member. 10th older sister both guided and supported me. When my son was still only a few months old, she and I often had to work late into the evening, long after the office crush had closed. 10th older sister would bring my son into the office and look after him. Nguyen Thi Binh passed away several decades ago, but memories of her will remain forever in my heart. Many sisters working in the National Women's Union office, such as Hong Ti, Ha Ti K, my friends Nan, Phuong, Nu, Thursday, and others, left me with warm feelings I can never forget. One day in late 1954, a few months after I'd arrived in the North, Dr. Pham Ngoc Thach came to see me. Yukmed Dr. Thatch while he was president of the Saigon Cholon Resistance Administrative Committee. Dr. Thatch said, "Uncle Ho wants to meet you." Dr. Thatch had told President Ho Chi Minh that a granddaughter of Elder Phan Chau Trinh was working in Hanoi. Hearing this, Uncle said he wanted to meet her. I was very excited to receive an invitation to the presidential palace, where Ho Chi Minh worked. He lived nearby in a converted worker's shed. Uncle greeted me and said he had known my grandfather when they were both in Paris, and that he regarded Phan Chau Trinh as the older brother who had helped him. I also knew that my grandfather and elder Winston Sack, Uncle Ho's father, had been scholarly colleagues and activists together during the early days of the 20th century. Later, I had many chances to meet Ho Chi Minh. Each time, I felt fortunate to receive Uncle's Ho's attention, concern, and encouragement. From 1957 until 1959, I studied in the first long-term course on theory and debate at the Nguyen Thi Quoc Academy. For the most part, the students were officials who had had no opportunity to study during the resistance. War against France. Like them, this was also my first chance to study theory systematically. I approached the course contents, which were new and intriguing, with great interest. At the same time, I was caring for my newborn son. Meanwhile, Kang was working for the military in the right bank region of the Red River, not too far from Hanoi. He would return home to visit us every few weeks. He and I had endured years of long and difficult separation. We had so many questions we had never been able to discuss. Now, at last, we could once again share confidences. After I finished my studies at the party school, I returned to the Central Level Women's Union, where I was elected to its party commission with responsibility for social welfare. Through this assignment, I visited many northern localities and acquired a greater understanding of ordinary people's difficulties. Of course, I concentrated on women, who were the country's main productive force in addition to caring for their families and their community's welfare. During 1956 and 1957, the Saigon authorities intensified their terror, arresting those who had been active in the resistance during the French War. No one among our people wanted war to return. The party central level urged us to stay firmly committed to political struggle. We brothers and sisters who had regrouped to the north were eagerly hoping for early elections to reunite our country so we could also return home and reunite with our families in the southern region. However, we have a saying, trees may wish for quiet, but their longing does not keep the wind from blowing. After 2 years, we were denied the elections as stipulated in the Geneva Agreement. Indeed, the enemy's oppression and terror grew crueler every day. We can reasonably call 1958 and 1959 the years of white terror. People in every area of the South seethed with vindictive hatred as the U.S.-backed Saigon administration waged a one-sided war against our people. Before long, the party had to shift its directive from political struggle exclusively to political struggle coordinated with armed struggle. On December 20th, 1960, we established the National Liberation Front, NLF, of South Vietnam. This news, like rain falling after a drought, satisfied the people's deep, expectant longing. The entire country burst forth, with determination to fight the Americans. In the North, a movement boiled up among those of us Southerners who had regrouped to the North. We asked to return to the South in order to struggle directly alongside our compatriots. During those days, the chance to go to be was every person's greatest wish and highest honor. Sisters at the Central Level Women's Union prepared to leave on their march to the South. Older sisters Ludon and Phuong were both journalists, whose husbands had stayed behind in the South. They received first priority. Like them, I received ideological orientation from older sister Nguyen Thi Binh in order to return to the South. Then, at the beginning of 1961, comrades from the Reunification Committee came to the Women's Union and asked to borrow me for 6 months to work for the NLF in foreign affairs. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After the NLF's formation, the people's struggle in the South erupted with vigor. In 1960 and 1961, the general uprising exploded in Ben Tre province, spread quickly to neighboring Maido, Tianjong, and Dong, Hap province, and then rippled across the entire South. We realized we needed to develop a diplomatic front synchronized with the political and military fronts. A part of me wavered when I first heard the news that I had been assigned to work in foreign affairs. It is true that I had skills in French, had been an activist in Saigon, and had worked directly with many different groups of people. However, except for part of my childhood in Cambodia, I had never left the country. Yet the South was my flesh and blood. I cannot refuse any task. In the middle of 1961, I returned to the Reunification Committee, which assigned me to its Foreign Affairs section under Comrade Luton Thursday, with Hong Bich Sun, also known as Ho Lin, as Chief of Cabinet. I served as Deputy Department Head for Comrade Vo Dong Jong. Several months later, became Head of Department 1A, with responsibility for NLF people-to-people diplomacy. By this time, we had established people's mass organizations in the NLF, using the NLF's newly formalized status. We sent delegations to participate in meetings organized by collegial international organizations. Our Liberation Youth of the South became a member organization of the World Federation of Democratic Youth, FMJD, Fédération Mondiale de la Jeunesse Démocratique. Our Union of Liberation Trade Unions joined the Federation of World Trade Unions, FSM, Fédération Syndicale Mondiale. And our Vietnamese Peace Committee took part in the Committee for World Peace, CPM, Comité de Paix Mondiale. At the end of 1961, Vietnam fielded its first delegations to international events for people's organizations. Older brother Nguyen Van Tom, nicknamed Muoyu, literally 10th Gang, because he was a little heavy, led a delegation to the World Congress of Trade Unions, while Nguyen Van Hue went to the World Peace Congress. Both organizations met in Moscow. In June 1962, I joined the World Congress of Youth, UI, in Budapest, and then, in July 1962, attended the World Congress of Democratic Youth in Leningrad along with poet Tan Hai Dr. Nguyen Xuân Pui. At that time, I was 37 and had to register my age as 32 in order to qualify as a youth. When I joined the Reunification Committee, we all changed our names in order to maintain secrecy. When Van Duck, one of the comrades leading the Reunification Committee, suggested I take the name of Ben since Ben means peace. Then, he said whenever I went overseas, it would be easier to create sympathy and, besides, Ben was also an easy name for foreigners to say. At his suggestion, I changed my name from Yen Sa, my alias throughout the resistance war against France, to Nguyen Thi Binh. The first two international congresses I joined were in two socialist countries, the Soviet Union and Hungary, which supported us by covering all costs for travel, housing, and food. Thus, our conditions for social action were indeed favorable. For the first time, these conference participants met colleagues from the South. That is to say, they met real Viet Cong. Everyone was delighted to see us. We were showered with affection and admiration. You Vietnamese are so small, they would say. How can you fight the Americans so heroically? Some participants were confused and said, the United States is so rich. Why would the Americans invade Vietnam? Our mission was to explain to our friends the meaning and the principled nature of our struggle. We always had two delegations at such international meetings. One came from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRVN or North Vietnam, and the other from the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the NLF or Viet Cong. The conference presidium would always ask Vietnam to take the floor first. The DRVN delegation would then yield to the NLF delegation. Whenever we climbed on stage, the entire audience would stand, for our struggle had gained admiration from the world's peace-loving, progressive groups. We asserted that the people of South Vietnam had no alternative but to rise up against the invading enemy and no wish other than to live in peace and enjoy normal lives like everyone else. These words, which we conveyed with sincerity and simplicity, won the participants' hearts, minds, and empathy. Whenever I spoke, I was deeply moved, for the sentiments I expressed came from my heart. I saw clearly that I was trying to tell our friends from 5 continents about the profound aspiration of the millions of my compatriots suffering and dying at that very moment in an unbeliever. Bly arduous struggle. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. My 6 months on loan to work in foreign affairs had ended, but I could not return to the Women's Union. Every day, we in the NLF office needed to expand and develop our diplomatic front in coordination with the military and political fronts. Further, I had become a foreign affairs staff person. Of course, I never imagined that I would continue that work for 14 years, until 1976, when the South was completely liberated and our country was formally reunited. Those 14 years brought many experiences, gave me a different forte, and were an important life season. Beginning in 1962, I was continuously active on the international front, joining meetings and friendship visits, and then participating in official delegations. At the end of 1962, I traveled to Indonesia with Professor Nguyen Van Hue, General Secretary of the NLF Executive Committee. This was the front's first official visit to a foreign country. At that time, the Indonesian Communist Party had more than 3 million members plus 10 million youth members in party mass organizations. The party had a positive influence on President Sukarno, whom Indonesians regarded as the father of Indonesian independence. Indonesia and Vietnam shared close, analogous points of history. For Vietnam seized political power 2 days after Indonesia, and then both countries faced long wars to achieve their independence. The two communist parties of the two countries were close. Indonesian Party General Secretary Dipa Nusantara Aidit had great respect and admiration for Uncle Ho, whom he had met in Indonesia. When we arrived in Jakarta, the Indonesian protocol staff wanted to know the delegation members' diplomatic ranks in order to prepare the appropriate, official welcoming ceremony. I did not know how to identify us. I said we were from the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which was like a government, and so the members of our delegation were like the front's ministers. After that, the Indonesians greeted our delegation according to the exact protocol for a government, and sometimes with even more ceremony. President Sukarno and many ministers of state wanted to meet with us. The Communist Party and mass organizations, including the youth and the women, organized gatherings to welcome us and express strong support for the Vietnamese people's struggle. The revolutionary fervor in Indonesia at that time brought me great delight. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. One event early in my diplomatic life is something I can never forget. Perhaps I can say that these were my first steps as a diplomat. The occasion was my second visit to Indonesia in around 1964. Our task was to encourage the Indonesian government to allow the NLF to open a representative-level diplomatic office in Indonesia. I needed to meet President Sukarno, but I did not know how to arrange such a meeting. Comrade Adit suggested I attend a gala where I might meet the president. I immediately agreed. The Indonesians' organization for the gala was monumental. All the elite Indonesians were present. Adit whispered a few words to President Sukarno. The president came up and invited me to be his partner for the opening dance. I was terribly distressed because I did not know how to dance. Yet my assignment was to speak with the president in order to advance the front request. I summoned my courage and accepted his invitation. I took advantage of the first few minutes to introduce myself and present the front's wish. But after several dancing steps, I was totally confused. Comrade Adit must have perceived the awkward situation. He hurried up and accompanied me away to a seat. By then, many people were on the dance floor. Perhaps the president and his other guests forgot about my lack of sophistication. In truth, my incompetence mortified me. But I reminded myself that at least I had completed my responsibility to my country. We also heard of General Suharto, the infamous anti-communist based in Bandung. Then, in 1965, a military coup raided the offices of the Indonesian Communist Party and its affiliated organizations, shattering the party structure. A terrible massacre occurred. The army arrested and assassinated many party leaders. This news deeply saddened us. It was especially painful because we could not help the friends who had wholeheartedly done so much for us. For a long while, I had no chance to visit Indonesia. Only in 1991, after more than 20 years, was I able to join the delegation of President Vo Chi Tsong to the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Jakarta. Indonesia had changed perceptibly, but I was sad not to meet our friends from years past. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The most memorable event for me in 1963 was the Third Congress of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, APSO. It took place in Tanzania in March. Vietnam's resounding victories were a major inspiration for the national liberation movements of colonized peoples. In 1962, Algeria had gained independence from French colonialism. Facing the turbulent movement for national liberation, the British imperialists had granted independence to many countries. The non-aligned movement had been established, implementing the Bandung spirit. The Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization came into being within that context. Tanzania, a country in East Central Africa, had just won its independence from the British imperialists. People often said that the British were more fair than the French. I had never been sure of that statement. In fact, in Tanzania, I saw that the statement was inaccurate. Tanzania was such a vast country with huge, dense forests, yet it had very poorly developed agriculture. We drove several hundred kilometers along modern asphalt roads. The land was empty and deserted. Now and then we could see some farmers poking with sticks, sprinkling a few corn seeds into the soil. Africa is the oldest continent on Earth and is considered the cradle of humanity. When I first visited Tanzania, farming was still on a subsistence level, as is still true in many areas of rural Vietnam. The situation was the same in the other African countries that I visited later, including Guinea, Mali, Uganda, Angola, and Mozambique. As in Vietnam, European colonialism had kept the peoples of Africa uneducated, divided, and uncertain about their abilities and their own intrinsic worth in comparison with their white rulers. Thankfully, that is changing. The peoples of Africa are so beautiful, well-built, physically strong, warm-hearted, good-natured, and genuine. We can hope that in the 21st century, this ancient continent, which was colonized for so long and often with such devastating results, continues to develop according to priorities and choices formulated by the country's citizens themselves. We can all benefit as African nations increasingly take their rightful place on the world stage. The Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization has contributed to that much-needed change. This particular Afro-Asian Congress was organized in a lovely setting at the foot of famous Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest and most beautiful peak with a year-round cap of snow. I led the delegation from South Vietnam. Our delegation's main issue was joining the Secretariat and achieving permanent representation so we could speak and generate timely support for our struggle. Other countries, such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also wished to join the Secretariat. We had support from the Soviet Union and some other nations, as well as ardent support from Ben Barka, an influential leader from the Moroccan movement. As a result, the NLF became a member of the Secretariat. This was a great victory and a first in people-to-people diplomacy for the NLF. Thereafter, we always had a representative from the NLF at the APSO Secretariat in Cairo, Egypt. Indeed, from that time onward, we could at last launch campaigns to secure support from Afro, Asian, and Latin American countries. I cannot refrain from saying at least a few words about Ben Barka. He was a true international combatant fighting with resilience for the rights of working people, for national independence, and for the equality of nations. The imperialist forces stalked him. He was found missing in 1965. APSO has since dedicated a Ben Barka Medal to those who have made significant contributions to the movement for Afro-Asian solidarity. In 1974, I was privileged to receive this priceless honor. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I attended many international conferences on issues about women, legal affairs, economics, and other topics. Some years, I would be abroad for 7 or 8 months. In order to save on travel expenses, we would sometimes stay in the Soviet Union or China between conferences. The first few years, I kept a diary of our trips, but later on, extensive travel made it impossible to keep track. Although we kept no records, I still have my memories of the comrades who were side by side with me during those challenging years of turmoil and complexity. Izembemba Bingtang, cherished as a younger sister of whom I was very fond. Even now, my heart feels torn when mentioning Benton. I knew her from a Saigon student movement in the 1950s. An excellent student and a great activist, she had beauty, a strong character, and a special quality of mind and manners. She was someone whom everyone loved. Benton was my secretary, since she excelled in both English and French. In fact, she was more like an intimate companion, sharing both sad and happy moments as well as the trials and tribulations of our everyday life. For a while after 1975, Benton was Vietnam's ambassador to Germany. Then she was assigned to Vietnam's delegation at the United Nations. Although she was a very talented woman, Benton's private life was not very happy. Her life ended in a tragic motorbike accident while on her way to attend the funeral of Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, a mutual friend and a colleague from our years together in Paris. Ngoc Dung, whose real name was Swan, was my age and had been a top student at Petrusk High School. She joined the Vietnam Women's Union in the South as a journalist. Dung was also a member of our negotiating delegation in Paris. So our international activities meant that our paths crossed frequently. Ngoc Dung was spirited and bright, always coming up with new initiatives. She was full of energy and an enthusiastic worker. Since Dung and I fully understood each other, we worked well together, with every task efficiently coordinated. Later on, she was Vietnam's ambassador to the United Nations. Is for me for Lao Goma, Ifas Slap Sitten for Vo Dong Jiang, Huang Bixun, Zung Ding Tao, Lei Fung, and Li Van Shao. All have left me with permanent memories. I have always had many friends, with whom I could share thoughts and ideas as well as difficulties and challenges. That closeness gave me greater self-confidence and strength. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. From 1963 to 1968, I participated in many international women's conferences, including meetings held in Moscow, Russia, Sofia, Bulgaria, and Nîmes, France. Women throughout the world strongly supported Vietnam's struggle, but they did not always sympathize with all our claims. At the International Women's Executive Committee meeting in Salzburg, Austria, Jeanette Vermeers, who had shown constant support, nevertheless objected, saying, "Why do you emphasize the United States as an imperialist aggressor? If you stop calling the Americans aggressors, then we could immediately support your statement." I smiled and replied, "Sister Jeanette, I think that we have condemned them so little that our words have been to no avail. Perhaps that is the reason we have failed to capture the Americans' attention." We laughed and hugged. Jeanette said, "All right then. We love the people of Vietnam, so we will try it your way." The conference passed a resolution strongly condemning the United States. Our friends loved us not only because they affirmed our just cause, but also because they admired the determination and sacrifice coming from a small nation standing up against a colossal empire. We were ready to sacrifice all and determined not to be enslaved. Our narrative was like the biblical story of David against Goliath. The more we fought, the more we were triumphant. We had to work so our friends from all continents would understand that the United States was conducting a war of aggression in the south of Vietnam. We also had to state clearly that the NLF was the only true representative of the Southern people in the struggle against U.S. aggressors. This was not easy in the first few years. Our goal was to quash the Saigon administration's claims as nationalist and patriotic. We persevered even when some foreign sympathizers remained uncomfortable with what they considered as our inflexible stance. We would explain our point of view until we convinced them. Later on, after the 1968 Tet Offensive, when Lawyer Trinh Dinh Tao set up the Alliance of National, Democratic, and Peace Forces, we no longer claimed that the NLF was the only true representative of the South of Vietnam. However, then we encountered disagreement from the same friends. Now, they argued that even if other patriotic forces joined us, we should still portray the front as the only worthy and true representative. To this, we repeated our point that the NLF's fundamental intent was to rally all forces in common struggle to build a broad-based movement, so that our friends would agree with us out of comradeship and trust. Our role was difficult for governments. Even though the Soviet Union supported our struggle, the Soviets were cautious and restrained when using terms such as American imperialism or aggression. We would have long, elaborate discussions in order to produce joint statements with the governments of the countries we visited. Only through perseverance could we reach agreement on terminology. In most cases, our international colleagues would avoid mentioning the United States by name, and they would use interference instead of invasion. This demonstrated how powerful the United States was internationally and how resilient and determined we were in the face of such a formidable challenge. One of our key objectives was to gather the support of anti-war and peace groups in the United States. The first time I met representatives of the American anti-war movement was at a 2-day conference held in Bratislava, now in the Republic of Slovakia, in 1967, with about 40 attendees. I was not impressed with these Americans at first sight. They were not dressed tidily, and their way of speaking seemed overly casual. Yet, when I described the situation in Vietnam, the American participants listened attentively and asked many questions. I spoke especially about the war in the South, including the American military's crimes. and I expressed our people's aspirations for peace and independence. I also emphasized that we had no ill intentions regarding U.S. interests. The ambience became increasingly relaxed as the conference progressed, and as the participants came to feel closer to one another. By the end, we were shaking hands and holding hands and promising to alert the public, especially in the United States, so that the world would grasp the reality of what was happening in Vietnam. We asserted that, together, we would strengthen our solidarity to end the war, a war the American public had never wanted. I also joined 2 separate meetings with American women, one in Jakarta, 1965, and one in Paris, 1967. These meetings were distinctive because the women were inherently more open and tolerant than their male colleagues. Many American friends could not hold back their tears when they heard descriptions of the suffering of Vietnamese women and children. These meetings were held mainly at the initiative of Women's Strike for Peace. After 1975, I met again old friends, such as Cora Weiss and Mary Clark, from the United States. They had been active members of this movement, women whom I regard as friends. I can never forget them, because they spent a precious part of their lives fighting bravely for Vietnam. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Between 1963 and 1965, disagreements appeared within the international revolutionary movement. These negatively affected the struggle in many countries, including Vietnam. At first, China launched a campaign criticizing Yugoslavia's revisionism, and then China launched a media campaign so that the sharp, bitter Chinese arguments could easily persuade listeners. Then China switched to attacking the Soviet Union directly and condemning Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union's leader, as a pro-American revisionist. Our policy through both the resistance war against France and the resistance war against the United States had been to secure support from the socialist bloc, and especially from the 2 big broth heirs, the Soviet Union and China. We needed to build a strong foundation under our own struggle. We tried to maintain our stance, but this was not always easy. In July 1963, a loud dispute erupted at the International Women's Congress in Moscow between the Chinese delegation and the organizing committee. A Chinese representative grabbed the microphone to assert the Chinese stance. Total confusion ensued, ending the conference. I was head of the Vietnamese delegation. Although we were close to the Chinese delegation, we did not approve of the delegation's conflict with the organizers. From that incident onward, the Chinese delegations were absent from all conferences of international democratic organizations. Around the middle of 1964, Chairman Khrushchev held a large welcoming reception at the Kremlin Meeting Hall during the Peace Congress in Moscow. This event won the sympathy of representatives from many countries. As head of the NLF delegation, I was wondering what to say when I met Chairman Khrushchev, whose reputation had been challenged. Finally, my turn came. I approached, shook hands with Chairman Khrushchev, and introduced the NLF as representative for the people of the South who were struggling against the United States. I thank the people of the Soviet Union for supporting our just struggle. I also expressed our hope that, along with many other countries, the Soviet Union would support Vietnam even more. I was not sure if the interpreter repeated everything I said, but I did notice that Chairman Khrushchev smiled and nodded. I sighed with relief, knowing that I could not have stated our position more correctly. The 1968 Tet General Offensive erupted when I was in Hanoi to prepare for a trip to France. The whole country watched as the People's Liberation Army attacked and besieged American buildings and bases. From this point forward, people had more faith in the strength of our guerrilla forces. In April 1968, I received an invitation to a women's conference in Nîmes, France. Two important events occurred as I was traveling to Paris. First, the French student movement protested the government's education policy, a protest that overlapped with many social groups' dissatisfaction with the de Gaulle government. Several of the large demonstrations in France interrupted public life. At the same time, Vietnam opened communication between the DRVN government, represented by Minister Nguyen Thi, and the United States government, represented by Ambassador Avril Harriman, to explore the prospect of political negotiations. As the Tet 1968 general offensive spread across the southern battlefield, the United States began to recognize the impossibility of winning a war against a people so determined to fight for independence, freedom, and their country's reunification. The need to de-escalate the war became apparent to American leaders, forcing them to consider a political solution to extract the United States from an increasingly hopeless war. However, the United States also wanted to negotiate from strength. We saw this as a timely opportunity to fight on two fronts with a combined strategy: attack on the battlefield and negotiate at the conference table. When I met Nguyen Thi in Paris during that trip for the Women's Conference, I believed the diplomatic struggle would gain in importance. However, I certainly did not expect to return to the magnificent capital of France 6 months later with an assignment involving enormous responsibility. That assignment would mark a turning point in my work and life.